Gentlemen, let us reconvene the session. We are just at 1:01, and so just before we go to the minister, who you see present here to my immediate left, I just want to turn to the regional chief for a quick update.
Thank you, Minister. But before we move on, I just want to acknowledge, I seen him here earlier on today with his wife, candidate Joan Phillip for the NDP. Grand Chief Stuart Phillip, that he is on another 3-year tenure as the president of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs. So just want to acknowledge him and congratulate him and thank him for his, I think this is his 8th term as the Union of BC Indian Chiefs president, and congratulate him on another tenure. So congratulate him, thank him.
Thank you very much, Regional Chief. So let us pick up our agenda. Ministry of Energy, Mines, and Petroleum Resources. We are joined by the Honourable Minister Michelle Mongal. To move to microphone 5 here to my right. She'll speak from the podium, and then we'll see where we are relative to the time frame for discussion and potential related resolutions. Minister.
Thank you very much, and thank you all very much for inviting me to be here today with all of you here on the Musqueam territory. I'm very pleased to be able to speak with you today, and very pleased that the skies in Castlegar were open and the plane was able to get out and I was able to get here. Before I get started in my remarks, I promised Joan that I would make sure to promo her. I bought one of her beautiful brooches. I'm a brooch lover, and so bought one of her beautiful brooches. She has brooches and baskets just out there. Lots of shopping to be had out there, so I just wanted to share with you my appreciation for her work and encourage you all to, if not for yourself, it would make a lovely gift to get one of her brooches or a basket. So today, my remarks, I'd like to share a story about an ancestor of mine. His name was Joe Bourgeois, and he was in and around the Kootenays, the Ktunaxa territory in the 1890s, seeking his fortune. He was listed as a fur trader, a logger, a laborer, and a free miner. And so, like many people of European descent, made his way through Canada and in seeking fortune and panning for gold and whatnot. So he had been in the area, the year was 1895, and he'd been in the area for about 25 years. And he made his way after not being successful in the Rossland area. He had found some things, but he sold those claims and before even being able to seek his fortune or get his fortune. So he made his way over to the East Kootenay. And he was at St. Eugene's Mission in 1895. And because he had been in the area for about 25 years, he actually had some ability to speak the Ktunaxa language. And he was overhearing a couple of men speaking about Chikamon stones. Now, Chikamon stones were galena lead ore, so silver lead ore. So if you're seeking your fortune and your name is Joe Bourgeois, your ears perk up when somebody starts talking about Chikamon stones. So he goes over and starts asking them about that. Well, as it turns out, some women were huckleberry picking, and they had come across the stones, and they had picked them up because the Father Kokala for the St. Eugene's Mission had told them that these stones were very important to white people, and that they should collect them. Well, Father Kokala knew what those stones were, and he knew that they would make him rich. But to the Ktunaxa women, those stones weren't nearly as important as the huckleberries. They needed those huckleberries because that was their traditional way of life. And so they tossed aside the Chikamon stones and made more room for them in their baskets. So Joe, being who he was, said, okay, well, where did they find them? The men told him, and Joe was out of the mission like a flash of lightning and heading up the mountain. And sure enough, he found those Chickamauga stones. And he staked his claim. He sold that claim, made one heck of a profit, because what it ended up being was the North Star Silver Mine, which was the richest silver-producing mine in Canadian history. Joe took that money and his trajectory in life from that one moment where we overheard two Ktunaxa men talking about these stones. He had a beautiful farm. He brought his youngest brother out from Quebec, who is my direct ancestor, my great-great-grandfather. And generation after generation after generation, they had food on the table, they had freedom of movement, they had wealth, and they had happiness. What did the Ktunaxa get? The Ktunaxa got a residential school, they got trauma, they got poverty, two very different trajectories from that one moment in time. And I tell this story because those two different trajectories, to me, are the exact reason why we are doing reconciliation now, and why we are in an era of reconciliation. Because we know what happened in the past was wrong, and we know that we have to remedy it, and we know that going forward, we have a lot of work to do, but we have to do it together. So what does that mean on a day-to-day basis? Because those are a lot of nice words, but at the end of the day, we have to see results in communities. So one of the ways that my ministry is achieving reconciliation in practice, or reconciliation, is economic and community development agreements where First Nations receive mineral tax revenue. To date, we've signed 34 agreements with 45 different First Nations through these economic and community development agreements. And I'll just give you an example that last June, we signed an agreement with the Tahltan central government, which will move approximately $7 million in taxes from Bruce Jack gold mine to the Tahltan. And here's what I think is really important, because then the question is, what will they use that money for? Whatever they want. It's their right, and it's their right to govern it as they see fit. It is not the government of BC's decision to say what that money should be for. Some of the things that we're doing in energy is that some of you may have heard that we are starting to move forward with the BC Hydro Phase 2 review. And I believe you have a resolution on the table for later today, about what kind of mandate the BCAFN should have in engaging for that Phase 2 review. So to give you some context of what the Phase 2 review is all about, it's looking into the future and how do we position BC Hydro for that future. We know we're going to have increased energy needs. How do we meet that demand? Where does the generation come from? Who owns that generation? These are the questions. There's been a lot of ideas, and we have to start working through those ideas and in terms of how do we implement them. And that's what this review essentially is all about. And of course, First Nations have a critical, essential, and fundamental role to play in that review and in the future. And that's why we've asked Anita McPhee, she's a former 3-term president for the Tahltan central government, to be one of our expert advisors. Some of you may know her. She's had a wealth of experience in terms of Indigenous engagement, what that looks like, how to make sure it's meaningful, but she's also done a lot of negotiation with BC Hydro successfully for her nation. We also have programs, I just wanted to make sure you knew about them, because these are programs that Indigenous nations are accessing. So we have our BC Indigenous Clean Energy Initiative that has $5 million over 3 years in provincial funding to 13 nations. And it's for a variety of energy ventures. And I'll give you an example. The Heiltsuk First Nation got $150,000 in August for retrofitting homes with energy efficient heat pumps. So moving families off of diesel and onto a greener source of home heating, which is high efficiency heat pumps, and also training people in the community for the jobs so that they can install them. So Heiltsuk First Nations citizens are installing these heat pumps, they are maintaining these heat pumps, and they are getting a good wage as a result. And another program that we're just going to start engaging on in November, so if this is something that is relevant for your community, don't hesitate to give my office in Victoria or Nelson, if you find that phone number sooner, give us a call and we'll make sure to connect you with the process. It's the Remote Community Clean Energy Strategy. So this is for remote communities who are currently off-grid and using diesel. How do they transition to GHG-free energy source? And so there's funding for that, and we want to make sure that communities, we want to help communities, about 80% of the communities who are currently on diesel, move off of diesel by 2030. So if that is one of your communities, we want to make sure you're involved, so please don't hesitate to give me a call to do that. I think I'm at the 10-minute mark or so, and we want to leave time for questions. And so with that, thank you so much for listening to me this afternoon, and I look forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you very much. Microphone 16.
Thank you, Minister Mangal. Judith Sayers, proxy for Hadassa, and I'm also the president of the Nuu-chah-nulth Tribal Council. Some weeks ago, the Nuu-chah-nulth Tribal Council wrote you because Phase 2 review did not include any engagement with First Nations. In fact, we were only to make feedback on that, and feedback is not consultation. You cause a lot of problems and a lot of issues by doing that way, and I see now that you're trying to amend that and change that, which is a good thing, but I hadn't heard that. And so, you know, your government and your ministry has been leaving First Nations out of things, and that can't happen. We want to work with you, but you have to work with us. And you know, when you're doing the BC Hydro review and what are First Nations opportunities, and you just hire a bunch of experts and don't ask First Nations, you need to know that we are the experts. We are the ones who are doing clean energy in our communities. And the survey we did a year or two ago showed that there are $7 billion that First Nations want to invest in clean energy. And then you decided on Site C, you deprived us of any opportunities, indefinitely suspended the standing offer program, the only place to actually create energy for revenue. And there's a lot of reconciliation that needs to take place between your ministry and First Nations, because the industry has been taken from us, and right now we're focusing on becoming grid independent and doing our own projects. So I'd like to say that I'm glad to see you revise this, and especially throwing out those terms of reference. But why can't your ministries just sit with First Nations? They need to learn. They need to talk to the communities themselves. Sure, BCAFN can do it, but why aren't your ministry staff doing it? Because they're the ones that need to understand what First Nations need, what we require, what are our visions and goals for economic development and energy. We've been involved in this industry since 2000 and the early 2000s, and yet we're looked at like we're not experts. Well, let me tell you, we are experts. We have many communities across this province that are doing clean energy and want to do more. And we need to have those honest conversations with you, because we haven't had them yet. You haven't sat with us and heard us and what we want to do, where we want to go, what's important to us. It's just all Site C. And that's, you know, for me, it's very disappointing that we always have to raise issues with you instead of just automatically being considered someone to talk to. And we really appreciate that kind of a relationship. You got an idea, come talk to us. We're open. We want to work together. We want to do things that are best for our communities, and that's all we're asking for. So I appreciate that you've revised this, and like I said, we didn't have an answer back from you on our letter, and just wanted to put that out there, that it's just really, really frustrating trying to work with you, your ministry, and doing what we need to do in clean energy. Thank you.
A lot there, Judith. And so I'll try and touch on a few things, and if I didn't get a chance to, then maybe we'll be able to have a conversation this upcoming fall in Victoria. So first, in terms of the BC Hydro Review, in terms of reference, we have an expert panel who bring expertise. I hope you'll let me finish before you write me off. But we have an expert panel who brings lifelong expertise in the field of energy, specifically with their careers. But by no means are those the only experts, right? Of course, Indigenous nations who have been involved in clean energy are experts as well, and that's exactly why the intention has always been a fulsome engagement on BC Hydro Review. And so that has always been there, and the terms of reference that I signed off on months ago had that in there very clearly. And so if that wasn't communicated clearly to you and to others, I apologize for that. When it comes to the standing offer program, the challenge that we had with the standing offer program is a financial one. We did a report, we did a review, a report, and what we found is that over the course of 20 years, standing offer program was costing BC Hydro ratepayers, so anybody here with a BC Hydro bill, $16.2 billion in excess costs. So that was all of us who were paying for that. So if we want to move forward with energy generation, and we do, and we want to make sure that First Nations have a very integral role and ownership over assets, we have to find a way that isn't going to cost all of us ratepayers a whole lot of money that is unnecessary. So that's the challenge that's before us. I think we're all experts and we're all very equipped to meet that challenge, and I am certain that we will, and I'm certain that we will find it through that review process.
Microphone 25.
Byron Lewis, Chief of the Okanagan Band. I have some, comments to you that, one of them is on your position in the energy mines and petroleum resources. Our community in the Okanagan we have about 25,000 acres, and we also have minerals on that were actually not only discovered on our reserve, but they were actually under development in 1942, 1943. And once the passage of the BC Canada Minerals Act of 1943 came into effect, the people that were actually mining those, which were our band members, just basically threw the stacks on the ground and walked out instead of actually recognizing the province are supposedly owning 50% of all minerals, semi-precious and precious. Now, if you talk about First Nations, and I've also heard this from government, even government officials, how we stifle business on, for resource development. Here you have an example of you as a province actually openly killing a mining industry on First Nations land without a qualm of, compensation or anything, and it doesn't matter if it's the forest sector or anything. You look at the Carrier decision where Carrier Lumber was promised a 10-year, and they basically come out of there with awarding over $195 million on there with the 10-year they didn't even have. And yet First Nations, at the same time, you actually killed a whole industry on our reserve, and yet there was absolutely no compensation, no anything, and that act still stands today. When you look at that and you take into consideration under the terms of Confederation, which British Columbia and Canada agreed to, and these were British Columbia's terms, that land and lands reserved for Indians were a federal responsibility. Yet we have to deal with continuously a provincial encroachment into our jurisdiction, which is on reserve lands, that's continuously stifling economic development, which basically governments and a lot of the people of this province accuse us of. That's a prime example of some of the actual impacts. Now, if we go off reserve for this whole free entry process and look at what you actually done, in some of the rivers around around our territories and everything, and it doesn't matter if it's in our territory or neighboring, you look at Mount Pooley. You know, when that actually, the sediments and everything, how that's going to actually impact the spawning grounds by almost cementing that, because that silt and everything is going to get in there, and that's going to be just like concrete. You know, there was no mention of the fact that that actually produced over millions of fish, and since it was actually in that system. And yet there's no compensation to the First Nations that are basically the ones that are directly impacted by these laws, which I say comes directly from your ministry. Now, when we start talking about, you know, about these impacts, I think, you know, the province needs to actually draw attention to the fact that there's court decisions around that, the most recent one that comes out of Clyde River that was basically about, you know, resource extraction and testing. And that court said that in that instance, that not only if you must look at the environmental impacts, but you almost must give consideration to the impacts on Aboriginal rights. We're talking fishing, we're talking hunting, we're talking all these other impacts that actually come from these resource activities, and yet there's absolutely no socioeconomic impact analysis that actually measures. Now, if there is one, I need to see it, but I know damn well there isn't one. So basically, what you're doing is continuously infringing upon us. But one thing you need to remember and take away from this is with that decision that comes out of Clyde River, we stepped through the door of consultation and accommodation, and we stepped through the threshold now as establishing damages. Because once you start determining the impacts to Aboriginal peoples and their rights, you're talking about the damages to those rights. So I think that's one of the things that you guys need to be reminded of. You're in the days now of damages and being charged with damages. And I think that's something you should take back to your ministry. And for the BC Minerals Act of 1943, you know, that thing should be chucked out, because you did not have the authority in 1934 to sign that, because I think it was Wawayacum that you guys are all, you know, the federal government is always ramming down our throats, said that reserves were actually turned over to First Nations in 1938. So that's damn near 7 years after that you and the federal government said, oh, we can divide up minerals under reserve lands, and basically there's absolutely no consultation. Even at that time, in 1940s, there was a level of consultation was required. There's absolutely no evidence anywhere that consultation had happened when the federal government and the province suddenly said they can divide up our mineral rights that exist under reserve lands.
So I'm going to give you full credit for knowing history better than I do, but I think we both can very strongly agree, from what I'm hearing from you, is the need for reform. There needs to be serious changes to the legislation that is governing our mineral tenure and our Mines Act. And we've started with a pre-engagement process for the Mineral Tenure Act, and there was a very large gap in terms of coming to consensus between all parties. And so we need to have some clear direction going forward to conclude that process. I'm meeting with FNMEC next week. We're just solidifying a time right now in terms of what that process would be. But also, we need to have clear direction from UNDRIP legislation, which we're bringing forward this fall. So that's for that. The Mines Act, we're getting started on that. We have an intentions paper that's gone out, and we're going to start with very deep engagement going forward. One of the areas that I keep hearing about, in particular, when it comes to some of the issues around mining, is placer mining. And so we want to take a very, very strong look at that particular practice, because of the negative impacts it has in Indigenous territories, on the landscape, and so on, but also the lack of revenue that's coming back to Indigenous nations as well. So there is a lot, as you've highlighted, that we need to get working on, and we've started. We're in early days, and we'll continue to work together.
Thank you very much, Madam Minister. With the 5 minutes or so remaining, let us go to microphone 7.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister, for speaking to us, because I don't think Bill Bennett ever showed up at one of these sessions, so we got to commend you. And I think with some of the comments, issues, and concerns that are being forward, I think it's because we want to have that dialogue with
Clear,
you.
yes, absolutely.
So I give acknowledgements as well to Musqueam, Robert Phillips with the First Nations Summit Leadership Council. So it was already brought up that First Nations Energy and Mining Council meeting next week. I think that was we've been trying to arrange that for a little while, and with the Leadership Council and the leadership around the table, we certainly support the work of the council and what's being done. And they've been working with the ministry for a number of years, and one of the big issues, the Mineral Tenure Act, which you just brought up. And but we support a collaborative approach, and there's been a lot of these workshops that were mentioned were unilaterally done. And now in the spirit of this United Nations Declaration and the principles and articles therein, not only nation to nation with Canada, but in your case, government to government between British Columbia and our nations. The letter that was sent, we appreciate it, from September 12th, and two concerns. One question, are you putting the Mineral Tenure Act reform process on hold? That's one question that's been asked, because we're running out of time. You have about 2 years left in your mandate, and right now, because we didn't get anywhere with the Liberals in the past, we're proposing that the strategy, the answers are all there. And we just need to have that process and reform it without delay, and because there's many concerns. The second one is the intentions paper for mining reform, and again, without our input. And we'll need, because a lot of times I know our chiefs are talking about free, prior, and informed consent, again, with the UN declarations and the principles and articles therein. And you heard it before about consultation, consultation, consultation. We need to have that collaborative approach and a partnership. And legislation, policies, a lot of it's being co-developed right now in a lot of different areas. I don't see any reason why it can't happen here. And my last point is the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy is just getting in the way. And you're the minister, and the premier has been saying a lot of good words, and we need to make sure that bureaucracy doesn't slow things down, because billions and billions of dollars are leaving our lands, our traditional territories, our hereditary lands, our Aboriginal title lands. And it just can't go to New York, Europe, Asia, it has to stay in our regions. That would mean prosperity, not only for First Nations, but prosperity for the regions, the north, the rural, the coast, the southeast, all of those places. Cookstown, thank you.
I'll just touch on first the bureaucracy. Lots of great people, but there is a culture that resulted from the last 16 years, and I think that's exactly what you're encountering, what I'm hearing from you, and also the urgency is because there's a culture there and a worry that it's not going to change. And I've seen a lot of changes in the last 2 years, but I appreciate that sense of urgency, absolutely. I'm a partisan politician, man. I feel it every day. And so here's one of the things. So we do need to figure out what the process would be, and to make sure that we're working in collaboration rather than one way, kind of monologue. We need to have a dialogue. One of the challenges that I've been thinking about recently, though, is that joint decision-making and joint leadership, we can't just keep doing it kind of one-off, right? We had that with the environmental assessment review. We need to have a process that we can continue to do over and over and over again, so that joint decision-making isn't one-off things that are happening with something specific, but is a way of being for government. To me, that's very important for reconciliation. And so I think the next step is for us to have these conversations about what does that look like, what is that relationship legally, what is that relationship in practice, and so on. So lots of big questions. I don't mean to put that forward as a way to stifle or stop or delay any of the processes that exist right now. I'm just seeing that that's a need, because we need to do a lot more of this type of collaboration, and we need to have a way of doing it that is consistent rather than ad hoc, so that it's more permanent. So that's my particular view around that. And in terms of the Mineral Tenure Act, it's on hold, but not not for a long time by any stretch. I want to make sure that we have the right direction that we all need from that UNDRIP legislation so that we can start moving forward, because what I understand is that the gap between the different parties involved, it's going to be hard to come to a consensus until we have that UNDRIP legislation that gives us very clear direction in terms of where this province is going legally with reconciliation. Great. Well, I would just say thank you all very much. There are some other hands, I don't know, but okay. Thank you all very much. My time is up, and I don't want to keep you from moving on with the meeting. If you have any questions of me, don't hesitate to give my office a call, send an email. I'm always happy to hear from anybody. And if we can't meet in person, there's always a phone call. So thank you all so much. Enjoy the rest of your deliberations over the next couple of days. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madam Minister. As it's become my custom, I apologize to microphone 8, 17, 18, and 19 that we weren't able to get to you.
I'll take George on instead.
So number 8, the first one on. We do, as you've noted, the regional chief did provide a gift to the minister, and so we thank her for her presentation, and I'll ask you to join with me in thanking her. And we will move to our next important topic, and we'll invite the Minister, the Honorable George Heyman, Minister of Environment and Climate Change Strategy, to join us here. And as you'll see on the agenda, this topic will be kicked off by the Regional Chief.
Thank you, Harold. Ministry that's very closely related to Minister Mungel's ministry is Ministry of Environment, and over the last year, we've worked closely with the Ministry of Environment in developing the new environmental assessment legislation. And the long history is that for far too long, our people voices weren't heard in how decisions were being made. And the intent of the EA process was to develop a legislation that would recognize First Nations' ability to make those decisions in regards to really what is the process. Is there a First Nations EA process? And now that will be a reality. Do we have the resources? That will be a reality. The resources will be brought forward. It didn't go as far as we would like to see, and for the simple reason because of the United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous People, and we wanted to go to that further step where both First Nations and the minister can make a decision on those major projects. So with the development of legislation on the United Nations Declaration, I think we'll get there. As a result of the legislation, we have developed an Indigenous Advisory Committee or Indigenous Implementation Committee as part of the legislation, and the IIC is made up of 14 members, and I'll name them out who are on this committee. It's Verna Power, Naileen Moore and Sunny Laborde, Chief, Angel Ransom, Namox from Wet'suwet'en, John Ridsdale, Nicole Capel, Anna Usborne, Chief Maureen Chapman, Bruce Muir, Jackie Thomas, Dave Norquist, Bob Chamberlain, Melanie Walker, and Ange Smith are on this IIC. Moving forward, I really encourage the minister to work with our council, the ministry, our First Nations Energy and Mining Council, to really start working and putting resources towards a province-wide meeting for all our First Nations in January 2020. And we're looking forward to really for the meeting, its purpose is to meet with the IIC and to develop workshops and how implementation would carry forward. The other matter with the Ministry of Environment is climate change. And it's really important to acknowledge the issues that we're all faced with in regards to climate change. The issues of many species of salmon that have climate change has detrimental effects on their populations. The many wildfires that we have experienced over the last 3 years, the landslides that we're seeing at unprecedented rates. And this year was on record, the hottest slide we've ever seen in the world. So as a part of that, the issue of climate change, at our Special Chiefs Assembly in March, the BCAFN Special Chiefs Assembly that was held in Merritt this past year, we passed a resolution number 6, 2019, declaring a global climate emergency. Further to that, another resolution was passed at the Assembly of First Nations AGM in Fredericton, and that resolution number was 04, 2019, called Climate Emergency and Support for the Development of a BC First Nations Climate Strategy based, well, that one was specific to BC, but there is one that did come out of the AFN in Fredericton. And I think, moving forward, we really need to work together, need to work with your ministry and gain some resources and support in development of a climate change strategy that really asks First Nations from British Columbia, what does that strategy look like? And also that we're really on a time crunch with many of the scientists out there deeming that we have less than 18 months. So this was probably one of the biggest issues on the federal election. We had the candidates, First Nations candidates here this morning, and the issue of climate change did come up, and I think it's much more than a First Nations issue. It's a national issue, it's a world issue, and it affects much more than just First Nations. It affects everybody in Canada, and for that matter, it affects a lot of our people here in British Columbia. So I'll leave it at that, and certainly pass the floor on to my colleague here, Minister Heyman.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chief TG. And I want to acknowledge that we're on the traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. And I want to thank the BC Assembly of First Nations and the Musqueam people for inviting me to speak with you today in this hall. The last time I was here, I think we were in the process of developing a direction on the Environmental Assessment Act. And we're still working on it, but we passed, I think, significant legislation last November in collaboration with the First Nations Leadership Council, with Chief TG, with Grand Chief Ed John, with Grand Chief Stuart Phillip, and with a range of people who worked with us and consulted with us, including the First Nations Energy and Mining Council. I was sitting listening to Minister Mungal take questions, and I was looking at the logo at the back saying BC Assembly of First Nations honoring our ancestors. And I think much of what we do when we talk about how we develop economies, Indigenous economies, broader British Columbian and Canadian economies, in harmony with the environment that is what sustains us and is our home, is about honoring our ancestors. But I also started to think that 100 years from now, 200 years from now, will our descendants, the great-great-grandchildren, look back on the decisions that we made in the middle of the crisis that Chief TG referenced, the climate crisis, and think that we acted honorably. So I try to hold that in my thoughts as I'm dealing with the conflicting demands that come to government all the time, and the choices and decisions that we make. When I wake up early in the morning, much earlier than I'd like to, some nights thinking about, are we doing the right thing with respect to Indigenous peoples? Are we doing the right thing with respect to climate change and what the future holds for us? I think, am I making the honorable decisions? I hope so, and I'm going to continue to hold that in my thoughts as we move forward. One of the things that I am particularly proud of in the last year of our government, and particularly proud of in the work that we did together on environmental assessment, is I had the honor of bringing in the first legislation in British Columbia that very explicitly and clearly referenced the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People as a guiding principle for the environmental assessment process, a process that we tried to design that would be based on transparency, on meaningful participation of communities that are affected, collaboration and meaningful participation and support of Indigenous people and Indigenous nations, and that would advance reconciliation in a way that, that didn't stop development, but a way that supported responsible development, development that was assessed and guided with Indigenous nations' input and decision-making, and that provided benefits for everyone. So at the foundation of this act is early engagement with Indigenous nations from the very, very start of the process, as well as with other communities. But Indigenous nations have a very specific and legally defined role that's grounded in the UN Declaration. And I think that's critically important. Too often we've seen proponents design processes without reference to what the interests and both cultural, economic, social, environmental, held by Indigenous people for generations, and then had to go back and revise at great expense, litigate at great expense and discomfort and no profit to anyone with Indigenous people and communities. So our idea was to identify those issues from the start, to identify if they could be addressed collaboratively or at all. In some cases, they can't be. And in some cases, projects can't go ahead without doing irreparable harm. But in some cases, they can. And it's to everyone's interest to identify those ways in which they can early. So we've tried to build this act and continue to work with the First Nations Energy and Mining Council, with the First Nations Leadership Council, with Regional Chief TG, to take the same spirit of collaboration into the development of the new regulations. There's a number of regulations that are of very specific interest to Indigenous peoples. They have to do with dispute resolution. They have to do with how we apply Indigenous knowledge, with how we collaborate with Indigenous-led assessment processes, as well as how, in the case of an Indigenous interest in assessment, a provincial interest in assessment, and a federal interest in assessment, we move forward effectively together. And we've tried to take on those regulations a blank page approach, a clean sheet of paper approach with the Indigenous Implementation Committee, so that we build it together from the ground up. And I'm not going to pretend, and Chief TG wouldn't let me get away with it, that we don't have hiccups along the way. So one of the things we have is an agreement to an oversight committee with Chief TG, with other representatives of the First Nations Leadership Council. And when we have had these hiccups or misunderstandings or things look like they're going off the rail, we've been able to come together and resolve them. Most recently, and I was happy to help facilitate this, I know that I've been approached for well over a year for a tripartite process with the federal government, the provincial government, and Indigenous peoples and leadership in British Columbia. And for a year, we talked about it, but nothing happened. It was difficult, I think, to get the attention of the federal government. I was certainly willing. And on the eve of the election, when it was again raised to me by the Leadership Council, we were able to get a letter signed by myself on behalf of the provincial government, by Catherine McKenna on behalf of the federal government, just before the writ was dropped, giving a clear commitment to a tripartite oversight committee on processes that involve all levels of government. I think this is an important step forward, and it's an example of what we can accomplish when we work together. I think I want to move on to climate because it kind of overarches everything. And I want to begin my comments on climate change and what the government of British Columbia hopes to do about it with our targets that we've set, our plans to reach those targets that are encompassed in a plan called Clean BC, our collaboration with Indigenous people that's so important to this was something that affected me very deeply 2 years ago when I attended the United Nations Climate Conference. You know, it's one thing to understand things intellectually, and it's another thing to understand them emotionally when they're presented to you in a compelling and unavoidable way. And I was on a panel with Indigenous leaders from around the world, including from Canada and Northern Canada, and people talked about the impacts they were feeling today, their fears for the future, the impacts it was having on their homes, their traditional way of life, their food sustenance economies, the foods and the plants that they harvested, and how that was not only an economic or a food security issue, it was an issue that went all the way through culture and language, because culture and language was founded on centuries of this way of life. And I understood it in a way that I never had before, that if we allow climate change to go unchecked, we're essentially allowing cultures, generations, and peoples to be made to disappear. And so I take the responsibility for us to take action very, very seriously. And I think I share the priority with the BC Assembly of First Nations, with the Indigenous people around the province and around the world, that we take meaningful action, that we don't simply talk about it, because future generations, our children, our grandchildren, their grandchildren, will and are facing serious impacts. As we deal with this, Indigenous stewardship of land, water, your traditional knowledge is key to the decisions that we make. We've seen many Indigenous nations already taking leadership actions to move away from fossil fuels, to change your collective carbon footprint, notwithstanding the fact that in terms of those footprints, it's certainly not the biggest part of the problem in Canada or globally. In our ministry, we're investing in Indigenous communities. We're trying to help improve energy efficiency by increasing the availability of clean energy sources, by supporting actions by nations to get off fossil fuels, whether it's to solar or whether it's to transitional fuels like using wood waste. We're trying to work with people on retrofitting homes and buildings to make them safer, more comfortable, and more energy efficient. The interest from our engagement on Clean BC from Indigenous peoples has been tremendous, and it's pointed to important places for us to step up and engage far more seriously and far more structurally with Indigenous peoples on fighting climate change. We're developing a climate preparedness plan following for 2020, for release in 2020, and this follows on the climate risk assessment that told us what I think we all already know. The risks of climate change to British Columbia, as well as the world, are severe. We're already experiencing some of them, but they are potentially severe, whether it's in wildfires, whether it's in drought, whether it's in flood, whether it's in disappearance of fish stocks, wildlife, forests, Indigenous traditional plants that are important to people's economy and way of life. These are all risks if we don't act, and we also have to, as part of our action, decide how we're going to collectively be prepared to adapt to the challenges that we're facing. My ministry has recently provided $100,000 to the First Nations Leadership Council for a working group that will be led by the BC Assembly of First Nations to engage further on our Clean BC initiatives and our climate initiatives, generally, specifically with respect to climate adaptation and preparedness. We will continue engaging, and will engage through the fall and spring. I think it's important for all of us in British Columbia to recognize the role that Indigenous people have always played as knowledgeable, integrated guardians of our lands, our waters, and acknowledge that the cultural history that you protect, that you take care of, that you carry forward is important to all of us. It's important to me personally. It's important to our government. So we have tried in my ministry, as well as in Forest Lands and Natural Resources, to put more resources into supporting the activities of the Guardian programs, to help with training. I'm pleased that while this is nowhere near enough, that we have been encouraging more conservation officer service members to have Indigenous officers. We also recognize the role of guardians who work closely with federal and provincial representatives. It is, it's daunting. There's a lot of work to do, and I think if we pursue reconciliation in a real way with meaningful steps and actions, whether it's the implementation of environmental assessment, whether it's supporting guardian programs, whether it's supporting joint action on climate that respects the knowledge and history of Indigenous people, we are taking more steps toward reconciliation. And that, in the end, is what reconciliation is, a series of steps, a journey. I look forward to being part of it as long as I'm in government and beyond, as long as I'm alive and a citizen of British Columbia. I want to thank Chief TG and others for all you have taught me in my time in office, for the opportunity to work with you, and hopefully together we're making a difference. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister, Mr. Minister. Just before we take the 10 minutes for questions, I do want to note the regional chief acknowledged and we all celebrated the recent re-election of Stuart Phillip to the presidency of the UBCIC, or historic term, long-term presidency. And I wanted to acknowledge that he is present with us at the moment and ask you to join with us. Microphone 8.
Thank you, Harold. Thank you, Minister, for saving us a few minutes. I first want to thank you and your government for your efforts on Trans Mountain expansion, or Trans Mountain Canada. But when I think about that, I think about so many other things. I listen to you in terms of climate change, and it's not an accident. It's really around economic and environment policy. We just heard from the minister, your honorable colleague, about reform to the Mining Act. And our folks are we're along the Fraser. We're really troubled with Mount Polley. And we're troubled about how government officials take decisions on the allocation of mining tenures, on the regulations or lack of regulations in terms of recovering or securing damage. And there's a law, but no charges laid. When a company deliberately doesn't take care with tailings that are then dumped into clean lakes, clean rivers. And then your government continues to authorize continued pumping of effluent and tailings into what aren't going to be clean lakes and rivers for very long. So I really appreciate your remarks about wanting to make good decisions. There's a really simple way to do that. Share the decision-making. Create the space where you don't have a chief of mining making decisions with far too much discretion. There aren't the kinds of standards that there ought to be. There should be legislative standards about protecting the environment, and they're not there. There should be clear penalties and requirements to put money up front to make sure that when they screw things up, that they can actually pay for cleaning the mess up. Instead, taxpayers are on the hook. You just talked about forestry and forestry policy. It's the same thing there. The policies that have led us to where we are have probably contributed to global warming. I think, Minister, that the way to move forward is to work meaningfully with the First Nations Energy Mining Council, my younger brother Robert Phillips and others, to make sure that you engage nations, not Indian Act Band, nations in shared decision-making. Thank you, Harold.
Minister. Microphone 5.
Thank you. Is this on?
Yep.
Thank you. First of all, I apologize if, as usual, I spoke too long and didn't leave enough time for questions. I'm going to respond quickly to your point about charges. We took office a month before British Columbia's statute of limitations for charges under BC legislation expired. Our officers continued to work with federal fisheries and natural resources to do the investigation, and we've made recommendations to the federal Crown, but they make the decision on charges. I know that the dumping continues to be controversial, and I also agree with you that taxpayers should not be on the hook for damage. That is one of the things that that I have thought a lot about since taking office, and I'm talking to my colleagues about. I'm not going to indicate that anything's imminent, but it's a concern that the people who create a toxic mess leave it for others to clean up. It's not acceptable. With your point about shared decision-making, we are doing our best through the engagement with FNEMC and the Leadership Council on Environmental Assessments. There is more legislation to come on this, I think, as you know, from the Ministry of Indigenous Relations.
I think we have time for one more question. Microphone 25.
Good afternoon. My name's Byron Lewis. I'm a chief of the Okanagan Band, and I'm also a co-chair of the National Aboriginal Council on Species at Risk that is mandated under that legislation to provide advice to the minister on the administration of the act, but also under A2 to provide advice and recommendations to the Canadian Endangered Species Conservation Council, which you're a member of. You know, one of the things that I really need to, to point out on this whole issue of species at risk, and look at that, how this province, through their use of Section 92, has gone beyond what they have for constitutional authority. What they don't have, and what none of your ministries have, is a constitutional authority to extinguish an Aboriginal right. Yet your ministries, including a Ministry of Environment, Ministry of Forests, Ministry of Energy, Mines and Resources, have all guilty beyond doubt with the fact that they have moved beyond just the of an infringement of a right to an actual extinguishment of a right, and that is something that you do not have the constitutional authority to do so. When you go in to look at that, to provide you an example, you have subspecies with the mountain caribou that are found over in the Monashees and through the Rocky region. And one of the things that you're looking at, the subpopulations are down to one subpopulation only has 2 females. And that is not a viable population under any type of circumstances. And yet, when you look at that from that standpoint, that you moved from beyond just extraordinary impact or an infringement to the actual extinguishment of an Aboriginal right. You're having steelhead on this rivers that are coming up that are under the same situation to where they can no longer be harvested. And again, this points to the management, the resource management that goes on in this province that has led to that. So basically what you're doing is extinguishing Aboriginal right without the constitutional authority to do so. But this also means, and what I said to your previous person up there, that, that's one thing about the Clyde River. It actually moves beyond the impacts to Aboriginal rights to environmental impact to determine what are the actual impacts on an Aboriginal right. So tell me, how are you going to go about looking at the socioeconomic analysis of that infringement to go forward with a justification, but more importantly, how are you going to deal with the compensation of the extinguishment of an Aboriginal right in this province? And that's not only including terrestrial species, but that also includes aquatic. So these are some of the things that I really want to bring to your attention, and also the attention that British Columbia is the only jurisdiction in Canada that now does not have a species at risk legislation in place. And I think that's one of the things that you really need to understand, that species at risk is a tool, is a management tool to avoid the extinguishment of a species leading to the extinguishment of a right. And this is the only province that hasn't done so. So I don't expect an answer out of this today, but I will be expecting an answer out of this sometime in the near future. And I think everybody in the room deserves the same type of explanation from this province of how they get the jurisdiction to extinguish when they do not have the constitutional authority to do so. And that's under resource management.
Well, you've made important points, and you've asked questions that deserve a series of questions that deserve a complex answer. You've said you don't expect the answer today, and I'm not going to attempt to provide a detailed answer. We are taking some measures on some of the issues you've raised. The negotiation of a partnership agreement with the West Moberly and Soto that is meant to be a template for other agreements with respect to caribou and the other areas where they're threatened on the verge of extinction, and on other measures of compensation. I can't speak to that. I am not in the ministry that is responsible for that, but those discussions I know go on with the Ministry of Indigenous Relations. In terms of the Species at Risk Act, it is part of my original mandate letter. We have consulted broadly. One of the messages we heard was in dealing with plans to address species at risk in legislation, that many Indigenous nations said Indigenous knowledge must be an important part of that and must be not left to regulation but included in the legislation. So the process has slowed down a bit, and I'm in the process of confirming my mandate and timetable with the Premier's office.
Thank you. We'll turn to the Regional Chief for a final comment on this panel and to thank our guests, and then we'll move to the forestry discussion. Microphone 5.
Thank you, Minister, and thank you for those questions. Very important questions, and also want to make note that further to the answer to Chief Lewis' question, we also are seeking more resources for engagement with the IIC and also for the First Nations Leadership Council, our 3 organizations, to create a BC First Nations strategy on climate change. And I certainly I certainly hope that this continuation of this good relationship we have continues and we move in regards to the many environmental issues that we're experiencing here in British Columbia. And, it's that cumulative effect of a mine here, forestry development here, a dam here. It adds up. Over time, more and more development occurs, and there's more stress on the land. And as we come to less and less resources, we're already seeing the detrimental issues of the decline in the forestry industry. Not only the effects that it has on the terrestrial species of many animals out there that we know are species at risk, SARA listed, or under COSEWIC. We need to deal with those issues, and we certainly hope that your ministry will work with our First Nations people. So thank you for those really good questions, and thank you, Minister Heyman.
Photo op. All right, thank you very much. I'll invite Charlene Higgins to be joined by the, as I understood, the president of the First Nations Forestry Council, Chief Bill Williams, to microphone 5. Welcome. And your 30-minute clock starts now at 2:05. Microphone 5, please. Microphone 6.
Hoichika. I'd like to thank the Musqueam community and their ancestors for being such a strong community, culturally and spiritually and business-wise, for creating this opportunity for us to be here today. My name is Bill Williams. I am president of the First Nations Forestry Council, and I'd like to continue discussions about how the province is actually treating us as the First Nations government. The story is exactly the same as what I've heard earlier today from the ministers, is that there's a lot of talk, and this talk does not evolve into real discussions with First Nations. Charlene will describe more in detail how our talk is there, but when the next step of going into action, the talk just seems to disappear into the woodwork someplace, and it doesn't go into creating policy, doesn't go into creating legislation, doesn't go into creating opportunities for First Nations. So, and that's in all the 138 forest companies that we are working with today. So I'll turn it over to Charlene to describe more in detail what's happening.
Thank you, Chief Wake. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank the Musqueam for allowing us on their territory today, and I really do appreciate the opportunity to be able to update the chiefs in the Assembly on the work that we've been doing. And this isn't work that we've been doing just over the past couple of years. This is a decade long of work that we've been involved in. So I'd like to take this opportunity to, I guess this does this. Provide an update to the chiefs on the development of a BC First Nations forest strategy and implementation plan, changes to forest policy, legislation and regulations, and the forest revenue sharing. And the last one in particular will be a very short conversation. In 2018, the ministry made a commitment to develop a BC First Nations forest strategy in collaboration with First Nations as part of their commitment to reconciliation with First Nations. And this is taken straight from the mandate given to the minister from the Premier in the mandate letter from 2017 that said, take a look and implement bring the principles of UNDRIP into action, into forest policies, programs, and legislation. So in 2018, we agreed, the province approached the Forestry Council and said, we want to go out and we want to hear from the nations and on what they see as the components of a forest strategy. Well, Keith and I basically rolled our eyes because we've been talking and with the nations for over a decade about changes that are needed to the forest strategy. But we thought that this would be a good opportunity given that the mandate was to implement UNDRIP. So we held 14 regional engagement sessions in 2018 around the province to get direct input again from First Nations to inform the development of a BC First Nations forest strategy and build on the input they had already provided in 2015 and in 2017. In January of 2019, there was a commitment right in the ministry's action plan that they would develop a BC First Nations forest strategy in collaboration with First Nations. And I'll come back to something that we heard a lot of from the ministers that presented today, and that's about action, how they're taking action, how their, action on reconciliation, movement on reconciliation will be judged by their actions. Well, this is another topic of conversation because this is all about inaction. This is the slide that they showed, and they came out, when they came out in 2018, they made a commitment, this is straight from their presentation to the nations, that they were gonna build a BC First Nations forest strategy with the nations that developed G2G relationships, drove policy change that nations would be involved in. You know, forest sector business opportunities, revenue sharing, input into, you know, a role in stewardship. So this is about an increased role in the governance and stewardship of forest lands and resources. So we did, you know, there was a strategy. We co-developed a strategy. The strategy contains nothing new. It's what nations have been saying, I know, and working with in this and working towards this for since 2006. So that's, wow, okay, 13 years. But I haven't aged. Doing this for 13 years, the nations have been working towards this. So this strategy and the priorities identified in this strategy and implementation plan were co-developed with the province and informed by direct input from First Nations in over 24 engagement sessions that we held throughout the province in 2015, 2017, 2018, 2019, extensive consultation and involvement of the nations so that their words, they could actually see what they were saying in words, in a strategy. And over the years, in past years, nations would come out, they'd come out to these forums, and until now, there was very little progress on the recommendations that they were putting forward to. So this strategy reflects the input from the nations of over a decade and their desire to have meaningful input into the governance and stewardship of forest lands and resources and the forest economy. They want to be part of the economy. And we launched the forest strategy at the forest conference we held in Kelowna as a new path forward to reconciliation with First Nations that recognizes nations as governments and increases their involvement in the governance and stewardship of lands and resources. The shared vision, and this is available on our website, and to anybody that wants it, the shared vision is to support the modernization of the government-to-government relationship between the province and First Nations through a collaborative approach for forest governance and stewardship. And these 6 goals are the same 6 goals. These are themes that have come up year after year after year: shared governance, joint decision-making, a strong forest economy that supports meaningful revenue sharing, legislative and development and reform, tenure reform, collaborative stewardship and land use planning, and maximizing First Nations involvement in the forest sector. That has been a goal identified in 2009 in the Working Roundtable of Forests. So what this strategy does is it lifts the bar, it implements the mandate letter that says, and the calls to actions to review for the minister and the ministry to review policies and programs and put the principles of UNDRIP into action. And the principles 24, 19, 26, they're all reflected in the strategy. So it just brings up the bar for all nations to play a role in joint decision-making, share in the meaningful benefits, and have access to tenure opportunities in their territories. So here we are today. This has been developed over the last year and a half. Well, it's been developed over the last decade. It's nothing new. And now we're coming to the province and, you know, saying, well, let's get on with it. Let's look at implementation and develop a work plan. And we were just told, you know, we've met with the minister on the 4th, and all of a sudden, 1.5 years down the road, we're told they have no mandate. They have no mandate to develop and work on implementation because it's tied to the reconciliation legislation. Well, I don't know how this work, when you look at tenure reform, policy reform in forestry, revenue sharing, this is not tied to reconciliation legislation. This is tied to a shared role of the nations as governments in their in the governance and stewardship of their forest lands and resources. So all this work on moving this forward is now being held up because they say they have no mandate. I don't know how you can say that you don't have, why would you commit to developing something, come out to the nations when you have no mandate in the first place? So, and you know, this is, I want to go back because this is if I can. The Premier just recently came out on September 13th, and he made a statement on the anniversary of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and he said, quote unquote, "It has taken far too long for governments to take action, and now they're not taking action." He says, "We are taking action to move UNDRIP forward." This was just in his press release. And I guess I'm concerned when this whole strategy is being held up with this UNDRIP legislation, when it also says in the press release that the new legislation that they're developing, they're consulting with Indigenous business, labor, municipal leaders throughout BC. I don't know what they have to do with moving and implementing recommendations put forward by the nations. I also wanted to update the chiefs in assembly on the revenue sharing and where we are with revenue sharing. Well, we're nowhere. Revenue sharing is unchanged, and they've capped the revenue shared at $44 million. So in 2018, a transition model was put forward for increasing forest revenue, and it was submitted to the province, increasing the amount immediately from 44 million that it's currently capped at to 100 million to 30% of stumpage revenues, and moving up to 50% of stumpage revenues. This model was outright rejected by the province. Increased forest revenue sharing with the nation is critical, that they benefit from the benefits being derived off their lands and resources. And I've been working very hard to get industry support for the forest strategy, to try and show the government that we have industry support for the strategy. And just this week, this Kofi paper on a new path forward came out, and they've actually supported the strategy. They actually support revenue sharing with the nations. And I don't know where they got this from, but they say revenue sharing should be 40%. That's fantastic. So that's great. And they also said, Kofi has also said, we support increased Indigenous participation in the forest sector. So in revenue sharing, nations, have a right to meaningful revenue sharing. Industry is on side, so where is the government?
You might want to explain who Kofi is.
Oh, Kofi is the Council of Forest Industries. They're the huge organization of all major forest industry in BC, and they've now supported our strategy. First time in history, history. I've showed this, this is a revenue sharing model that I've shared with the chiefs before, and what it shows is that it's their data. What it shows is that revenue sharing, was up to just under 6% in 2016, but in 2018, it's now less than 4%. It's 3.56 of just stumpage revenues collected. That's not even a fraction of the $13 billion industry. I just want to quickly move on to some changes in forest legislation that many of you are aware of. Letters were sent to all BC First Nations from the Chief Forester in November 2018, and then from the Deputy Minister, John Allen, in February 2018, committing to involve First Nations in the development of forest policy, including legislative and regulatory review, to put the principles of UNDRIP into action. You all have those letters. But then in the spring of 2019, they made changes to the Forest and Range Act, and they made amendments that in no way reflect what nations have been saying. The changes are straight from the Cattlemen's Association and the Mark Haddock report on professional reliance, because the public is concerned about public trust over the management of forests, and the Forest Practices Board recommendation report in 2017, that's exactly where the changes came. No input from First Nations. Bill 22 is a bill that is around the minister's discretion, around the transfer or change of timber harvesting rights. We asked that they include not only a public test, but the consideration of First Nations impacts on First Nations rights and interests, and they didn't do that. It was an opportunity lost to put reconciliation into action and the commitments, the principles of UNDRIP into action. We also asked that there be a clause put in there that there should be a minimum of a 10% take back on any transfers that would then be could be reallocated back to First Nations, because all of you around the table understand that every time you go to get access to tenure, all they tell you is that it's all been allocated to third parties and BCTS. The other thing that they're recently doing, and there's two things. There's the Private Land Management Act that I know that the Hulkaminum Treaty Group, they put in a submission. That we don't know who's having any influence on changes that they're making to that. We hope that that submission makes its way into changes to that. But there's also now this big tree policy. The province protected 54 big trees. They put a moratorium, and then they established this two-person panel with Gary Merkel and Al Gorley. He's from the Forest Practices Board, an ex-president. And we said, we want to be part of that panel. Well, they write the recommendations, not after the fact. And we were told, no, that this was an independent panel. I don't understand how if it's an independent panel if it's appointed by the province. This is a very big deal, because this panel is going to they're going to meet with multiple stakeholders and look at the ecological, economic, and cultural importance of old growth and big trees. So this is something they seem to, instead of working with us, we're supposed to be working, we have a partnership agreement with them to engage with First Nations on policy changes, and they're actually going around the Forestry Council. I wanted to update the chiefs on some upcoming events that we're co-hosting with the province again. The province held, they have another initiative out called the Interior Renewal Initiative, which is basically to take a look at what to do around waste and doing more with less, because we all know that the AAC, there's been over-harvesting and it's going down. And so they've done all these multi-stakeholder engagements, and they are engaging, we understand, one-on-one with First Nations, and that's great. We want to make sure that Nations' voice is heard and written down and brought forward, and we will be doing a submission. So we wanted to the province has agreed to come out with us and share what they've heard to date with the nations and get input from the nations on what they see are the key priorities for an interior renewal initiative. I know for a fact one of them is a change to the appraisal manual so that First Nations woodland licenses and all those licenses get put under tabular rates so that they are, not part of the market pricing system the majors are, because stumpage is killing them. So I just wanted to make you aware of these 3 dates that will be in Merritt on the 3rd. In October 8th, we'll be in Prince George, and October 9th, we'll be in Williams Lake to really look at what nations think and feel that this interior renewal initiative should look like. We held our first annual forestry conference in Kelowna. It was a huge success. It was a 3-day conference. Our proceedings are available on our website. It was attended by over 180 participants and over 103 First Nations participants over the 3 days. It was amazing. Day 1 focused on the forest strategy and implementation plan, where we got further input from the nations. Day 2 focused on the workforce strategy, employment and training opportunities. And Day 3 focused on industry and First Nations partnerships and what's working. So really, it was such a successful event. All the presentations, everything is in the proceedings, so they are available on that link. And I guess in closing, there's a resolution in your package. We're really seeking your support to push the province to live up to its commitments to start looking at implementation of the strategy. The strategy's been developed. It's developed with the input of the nations over a decade. We need to change the paradigm that we're operating under, where nations are, play a greater role in the governance and stewardship of forest lands and resources. We know that forestry is an industry in transition all over BC, the interior and the coast. The forest strategy is not just a strategy to support reconciliation with First Nations, but, as Robert has said many times, a strategy that fully meaningfully involves nations as governance in the governance and stewardship of forest lands and resources, and the economy, the business of forestry, is a way to support rural BC through the transformation of the forest sector. it's time for action. Everybody, all those ministers talked about action. There's no action, and now it's stalling. It's stalling moving this forward, stalling putting the resources out to the communities. And First Nations in BC have been providing recommendations for change in forestry for a decade. It's time for action. If the province really isn't truly going to move on implementation of the forest strategy, their commitment to UNDRIP is really just fake news. So I really, really look forward to the support for the resolution. And, you know, the new paradigm forward is really written by the nations in the new role for the nations to play in the governance and stewardship and revenue sharing, the meaningful benefits from resources derived off their territory. Haikshka Cooksjam, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions for the Forestry Council? If there, I see microphone 23.
Good afternoon, Tony Morgan, Gitnao Chief Counselor. Thank you for your presentation. I think the Assembly spoke loud and clear all day today about a major concern that we're all having with global warming and economic development struggles, poverty and food supply. What we're seeing in the last few months was the mill shut down, and what's still going on is log export is still alive and well, and we've been experiencing forest fires, fiber supply concern, and some of our endeavors are being denied, like the energy purchase agreement, even though we have a good plan and ideas for also resolving the global warming situation. I think some of the studies that need to be done are in regards to some of the work that needs to be done, it may be a little bit costly, but it has to be done. I think you got to start mapping the creeks that are starting to dry up and have a closure of forestry actions around them. No more forestry, because we're seeing a major decline in the salmon stocks because the fish can't climb up the rivers, no water. So it's getting pretty difficult out there in this part of the world. Now we're finally being offered revenue sharing in a time of when there's major struggles in the economic sectors. So I look forward to that October 8th assembly in Prince George. I'll bring more recommendations, but those are some of the concerns that we had. But I think it's a good time now to really put the foot on the throttle, because it's election time, and you're mentioning everybody's calling for action, but no one's doing any action. So that's the reason why I said all day today we've been mentioning that we want action now. So thank you.
Thank you. Let's go to microphone 7 for a comment, and then we'll move to the resolution.
Yeah, I'll be really quick. Thanks again, Harold. I'd like to thank the Forestry Council, because not only the CEO and the board and the president and everybody else, but all this hard work that they've been doing, I do believe it's going to be in vain if we don't do exactly that, that we got to really step it up as leadership in terms of making sure that British Columbia steps it up. And, you know, it's been mismanagement, as it's already been said, by British Columbia for decades. So when we had that meeting with Minister Donaldson, John Allen started by saying he's been meeting First Nations and a lot of First Nations. And then I looked at him and said, "Who are you? I've never met you before." So that just set the tone, because, you know, they're saying they don't have a mandate. There's work that's going on with the UN Declaration, but it's not just all UN Declaration. There's other areas, especially forestry. And the focus has to be there, because it can't be at the expense of everything. And we need to make sure things move along. EA was a good example, what happened last year. In the commitment document that was talked about yesterday, forestry is in there. The Liberals did not want forestry in there. They didn't want land use planning. There's children and families, and of course there's the UN Declaration. We did get forestry in there, but it needs legs. It needs to move along. It needs to get things done. And the BC First Nation forestry strategy just needs to be implemented. We laid it right out to the minister on a platter. It just needs to be implemented. And I told him, I said that if you don't do it, I'm just trying to make sure you don't get booed off the stage when it comes to the BC caucus and the First Nations leadership meeting that's coming up in November. It's all there. They laid it out, a document about that big, everything in there. We know that 4 or 5% is not good enough. We told them the leadership is prepared to do an incremental approach to get up to that 50%. It's already been said that the industry is on side. Everybody's on side, except for the minister, except for the premier. So we got to push this. Whenever you go to your meetings with the ministers, push it big, because we need to make this happen, and we need to make it happen very soon. Cookstown.
Thank you very much. Just that there is a few minutes left, and so if I could, I'm going to ask the delegation to turn their attention to Resolution 22, the development and implementation of a BC First Nations forestry strategy, moved by Chief Harvey McLeod, seconded by Chief Chastity Daniels. Get one got. Is Chastity, Chief Daniels here? Oh, there you go. You moved. Also present. And so, again, notes the work of engaging with you over the last 4 years, and then the work since 2018 with the ministry about a revised strategy, and then talks about the implementation plan that's just been presented. Therefore, be it resolved that the BCAFN Chiefs and Assembly fully supports the draft BC First Nations Forestry Strategy and Implementation Plan 2019, which affirms joint decision-making and an increased role of First Nations in the governance and stewardship of forest lands and resources. 2, the BCAFN Chiefs and Assembly directs the First Nations Forestry Council to report to the BCAFN Chiefs and Assembly and the Regional Chief regarding progress on the full support and implementation of the draft BC First Nations Forestry Strategy and Implementation Plan. Is there a need for a discussion of this support resolution? I see microphone 11.
Thank you, Harold. Cook the Christian. I would ask for an amendment to this resolution on what we put on the one related to the UNDRIP. I would read the BCAFN Chiefs and Assembly call upon the province of BC to consult in good faith for the full implementation of Article 19 of the UN Declaration, which states, states shall consult and cooperate in good faith with the Indigenous people concerned through their own representative institutions in order to obtain their free, prior, and informed consent before adopting and implementing legislative or administrative measures that may affect them. I request that as an amendment.
So just basically it's C, whereas C, you're asking for a change in just the introductory paragraph, the sentence? And can you just repeat that?
I'm requesting that it be put in the therefore be it resolves, because the issue is this, is the First Nations Forestry Council is not a title and rights organization and should not be consulted or dealing with issues that are title and rights in terms of our nations. And we have our own tables set up and processes are going on that are independent of. Yeah. And when this stuff comes forward and gets support, then the province goes to these bodies without talking to us. We talked about that earlier. I think it's a major issue, and we have to deal with it in this province somehow. These support resolutions are good, but they don't deal with the problems we have on the ground with overlap and things we need to have some substantive discussions on. And we just talk about this stuff, but we don't do anything about it. So I think in terms of Article 19, it's really clear that BC needs to consult with us and the representative institutions, which is not the First Nations Forestry Council, which is not the Leadership Council, which is not the union, which is not BCAFN. It's our own representative institutions, however the people decide to do that.
Okay, thank you. So just in clarification, so we're at, the request is to add a therefore be it resolved 3, and we're going to modify some of the language from Whereas C, similar to what we did yesterday regarding calling on the government in BC to engage, to consult and cooperate in good faith with Indigenous governments. And I just would sort of add, before adopting and implementing forestry measures that affect them. So we'll just make those slight adjustments to that, that language. Acceptable, acceptable? Yes? Thank you very much. Is there any further discussion on the resolution as amended? Seeing none, then may I call to see if there are any objections to Resolution 22 as amended? Seeing none, are there any abstentions to Resolution 22 as amended? Seeing none, then we declare, as per your rules, that Resolution 22, Development and Implementation of BC First Nations Forestry Strategy, is adopted by acclamation as amended. Thank you very much. And let us thank our guests for the presentation. And as we are doing that, we will turn our attention to our fisheries matters. You'll see on the agenda that first it is the national portfolio update. That'll be done with by Regional Chief and by Audrey Mays from the Assembly of First Nations National Secretariat. And then we'll turn to the First Nations Fishery Council for BC. Regional Chief. Oh, and just a quick reminder, if I could, on the economic development discussions, there are the toolkit books available for you at the desk. Each community needs to sign for those, and don't forget the climate change survey.
Thank you.
Microphone 5.
Thank you, Harold. I also have up here Gord Sterrett from the Upper Fraser Fisheries Conservation Alliance, who will give an update on the big bar slide. So first of all, as the on the national fisheries front, I hold this as part of the National Fisheries Committee, along with Regional Chief Roger Augustine from the East Coast. And the work that we do is to really advocate on our First Nations behalf to create changes in forestry legislation, and also the many issues that our First Nations are really experiencing coast to coast to coast, and also on the interior freshwater fisheries issues. So it's been a very challenging year, to say the least. Not only the issue of the big bar slide on the Fraser River, but also the fact that even without that major incident, that the number of sockeye that were supposed to be coming back up the Fraser was in the amount of approximately 4 million. And I believe the number came out to be 625,000. So one of the most disastrous years we've seen in quite some time. We've had, over the last year, several meetings with the Minister Wilkinson, and we've also had correspondence with Wilkinson in this region in regards to some of the issues that our First Nations people have experienced here. And it relates to the big bar slide and how decisions were made, and how First Nations were not consulted in those decisions. In particular, the issue where our First Nations people up and down the Fraser stated that they would bypass their FSC allocation, and stated that if we're in conservation mode, everybody should be in conservation mode, including sports and recreation. I should acknowledge, as a part of the National Fisheries Council, the representatives from British Columbia, Chief Dalton Silver, who also represents the Union of BC Indian Chiefs and the Fisheries File. I gave him the unenviable task to go to Hawaii and represent the AFN at the Oceans Canada, as part of the Oceans Canada Network on Science. And Michelle, Chief Michelle Edwards, who's here today, and her constant advocacy during that time, that very difficult time of the big bar slide, and her continued advocacy for our salmon, and also our technical assistance from Elder Cliff Atleo, and also the lead for the First Nations Fisheries Council, Jordan Point, who's also the technical lead for the National Fisheries Council. So a lot of the work that we're dealing with is include FSC fisheries, as well as the issues of commercial fishing and how those decisions are made, and also the fact that the BCAFN and also the AFN are interveners on the Ahoosid case in regards to your decisions to access to commercial fishing. We also have brought up the issues of aquaculture, in particular the issues with fish farms, and looking at how those have detrimental effects on wild stock. Inland fisheries, the freshwater fisheries in different regions such as Ontario and Manitoba. The issues of species at risk, and also the issues of protecting the coastal waters, such as the Ocean Protection Plan. And also the International Convention on the Convention of Biological Diversity. CBD, not the cannabis CBD, but this CBD. If you recall, the Convention on Biodiversity was the convention that set out the 17% on terrestrial lands, conservation area, and 10% on coastal areas. So as part of the National Fisheries Committee, we really had interest in that 10%. And recently they had, the meeting was held in Nairobi, and I want to thank and acknowledge Chief Byron Lewis for attending that on my behalf, and thank you for bringing up those issues. And he's well versed on the issues of biological diversity and also species at risk and all those many issues we deal with in Canada. And I think I really just want to, knowing that we have limited time here, that we do meet annually whenever we schedule meetings twice a year, but we also try to meet as much as we can in terms of meeting together just before AGMs and special chiefs assemblies, but also, you know, getting input from many regions about the many challenges that First Nations have across this country in regards to fisheries matters. There has been resolutions passed at the AFN Annual General Assembly in Fredericton. Is that Rebuilding Fish Nations? Is that what it's called? and Resolution 10-2019, Rebuilding Fish Nations, Advancing an Indigenous Fisheries Reconciliation Strategy. So this resolution was passed in Fredericton this year, and really it was to begin the development of a strategy in regards to the National Fisheries Committee over the next 3 years, and that reflects the priorities of our First Nations people from right from here, from the West Coast to the East Coast and the inland fisheries. And also to really build on advocating on our rights and our ability to make the Department of Fisheries and Oceans accountable for some of the decisions that they make. And I think it's really important also to acknowledge too that the issues of fisheries in British Columbia and across this country is one that could be an election item, and we certainly know that the correspondence between the many organizations here in British Columbia with DFO have not been good in how decisions are being made and how policies are being developed, but also too in how they're not accountable to what has already been stated in some of the court cases that already exist in the Supreme Court of Canada. Here, Musqueam, the Sparrow case, Guerin, and the many other cases out there that aren't being lived up to. So that's the other issues that we need to continue to advocate for and bring forward. So I pass the floor on to Audrey.
Okay, I'm on? Okay. Good afternoon, chiefs, proxies, friends, and colleagues. Kwe Jalasi. My name's Audrey Mays, and I'm the Associate Director of Fisheries at the AFN. I also want to thank the Musqueam First Nation for welcoming us into the territory, and as well as the BCAFN Assembly for inviting us, for providing this very brief update. Thank you, Regional Chief. You did a great job in giving sort of some of the highlights of what we've been up to at the national level. What I'm going to do is just sort of summarize these slides. I think you'll have a copy of it and access to it. So as stated, you know, our main focus is to advocate for First Nations input on federal legislation, policy, and programs. We also are there to support the inherent rights, Aboriginal treaty rights. We must remember we have 635 First Nations across Canada, and everyone has a different relationship, different agreements and processes with the Crown. So I guess our focus is to build the commonalities in the strategy so that we can move forward on those various rights. The National Fisheries Committee operates under a 4-pillar strategy. The first one is very important in terms of rights. The second one is access. The third one is capacity, and the fourth one is accountability. Now, these 4 pillars have been put forward to the Chiefs and Assembly approximately 10 years ago, and said that these are all common themes that First Nations could agree to, and they could fit themselves in with under each of those pillars. So whether you have Supreme Court decisions that have not been implemented, whether you have a treaty right, or whether you have a commercial or an aquaculture initiative going on, there was a lot of discussion about how to advance and protect those rights. We are guided by the AFN Fishery Committee. We have representatives from all across the country. We are mandated by resolutions. Since 2016, we have 34 resolutions. This last AGA, we passed 10 resolutions. So we have quite a very broad mandate. Some of our mandates are in support of specific regional issues as well, such as Big Bar landslide that'll be touched on in a bit. We report back to the Chiefs and Assembly twice a year, one at the Annual General Assembly as well as the Special Chiefs Assembly. We have 6 support staff presently. So when I was talking a little bit about how we get our work done, we have technical working groups. The National Fishery Committee goes back to their regions, and they forward names to the experts, your people that you rely on various aspects of fisheries management and all those other things. So currently we have an oceans working group, an inland working group, an aquaculture working group, and a national policy analysis group, which allows us to look at emerging policy issues on sort of an emergency basis. The National Chief, as Regional Chief TG had said, the National Chief has met with the Minister and has access to him. So there has been a number of meetings happening. And we'll wait to see after the election in terms of the status of some of those commitments. As I'd mentioned, the committee is set up from representatives. We also are connected to the AFN executive. This sort of gives you a a diagram of how we're organized. So back in February, when we did meet with the minister, these are some of the issues that we'll need to keep on top of. Number one is the Supreme Court decisions. Now, this has been an ongoing issue. We had our first resolution back in 2010, and at that time we had a national forum where various groups who had been fighting in the Supreme Court, such as Sparrow, we had the Ahousaht, Marshall, we had a couple other, the Gladstone decision, and we had other First Nations across the country that were saying, yeah, we haven't had ours implemented either. And so as the chiefs in the committee were talking and introducing themselves, they were able to say, hi, I'm Chief so-and-so, I'm from the Sparrow decision. Hi, I'm Chief so-and-so from the Marshall decision. Hi, I'm Chief so-and-so from the Najuan decision. So it came very apparent to us that these Supreme Court decisions have been in the process or being dragged along for decades. And this was unacceptable to the chiefs, and they instructed us to start talking about a mechanism or options, how we can force the government to honor those Supreme Court decisions because they had been ignored. The second thing that we talked with the minister was about co-developing an Aquaculture Act. Currently, the Aquaculture Act is underneath the Fisheries Act. So there's a great concern about how aquaculture is conducted across the country. It's very multi-jurisdictional. There's about 17 different agencies who are responsible, and it's also fragmented in that it's delegated to the provinces across the country. So there's not one real regime on aquaculture all across the country. Then there's other issues that get involved in terms of the use of the water. And so municipalities also come into that equation. Another thing I wanted to just touch base on was the Indigenous knowledge for the first time in the new Fisheries Act, which is now coming into force. They have reference to the minister may consider Indigenous knowledge systems for the first time. All the decisions in the DFO are made on science, and they've ignored Indigenous knowledge. And one of the things the chief said was, our science is equal to Western science and should be considered, especially when we're looking at fishery management issues within our territories. The other thing that was brought up was inland. We touched a little bit about it. The inland is a very complicated issue in that there's over 285 First Nations in various jurisdictions, different provinces, different treaties, but yet they have no capacity and no resources to have access to programs and support on fishery issues. It's very fragmented, and they've been left out of the fishery programs. Finally, we asked about funding programs and in particular the species at risk, and as well as the ARM program. Many of you have heard about the Aboriginal Aquatic Oceans Resource Management Program. People were asking about the reform of that and when there would be increases to that. I'm glad you guys were also talking a little bit about the provincial government. We have, I guess here in BC, you have better access to your province. Across the country, there is a problem with accessing the Canadian Council of Fisheries and Aquaculture Ministers. This is a very powerful group. They advise the minister, so they influence decisions. And we found out that they had 6 task groups. And so we made the formal request, the national chief asked the minister if we could access some of these working groups and get on their agenda and have a say on some of the issues that they deal with on their agendas. So as you can see, there's 6 of them. One is aquaculture, one is the inland, marketing, Bill C-68 implementation, that's the Fisheries Act, invasive species, as well as the oceans. So hopefully, we've been to 2 of these CCFAMs. We've only been to one of the Oceans Working Group to date, but we're still pursuing, and hopefully there'll be something tangible. If reconciliation is going to occur, that might be one of the things that we also push for in the future. Just to give you a heads up, a lot of you have been familiar on the legislative agenda. These are just some facts, some of the things that went on. Bill C-55, Oceans Act, so after the election, there will be implementation, there will be consultation and engagement, so heads up on that one. On Bill C-68, the Fisheries Act, these are all come into force now. There's a lot of new changes. Some good, maybe some not so good, or maybe not enough. But we have an opportunity to influence some of the policy development on the Fishery Act, so heads up on that as well. The only thing I would say about that, again, is get ready for there is an opportunity to bring in the Indigenous knowledge systems. So if you don't have a protocol or guideline on how to protect that, I believe the BC Fish Council are going to be having workshops and things like that on that. So just, heads up on that. Bill C-69, once again, that was called the Canadian Navigable Waters Act. We're back to the Navigation Protection Act. One thing to note about that for the First Nations, in the changes before that, they had excluded all waters in Canada. But now, after pressure, we did get all the waters scheduled in Canada, except they have to now go back and put them back in. So, where the change, they had only protected 97 rivers, 3 oceans, and so now it might be interesting to look at the schedule and see if your tributaries, your lakes, are protected under that act as well. There is quite a cumbersome process to get them listed as protected. Quickly on the National Aquaculture Working Group, I just wanted to update you a little bit about that. The minister did mention about a new proposed Aquaculture Act. They are currently drafting regulations under the Fisheries Act. They haven't formally tabled any act yet. We suspect because of the writ being dropped sometime in the November, December, early spring, maybe winter, they will have something tabled. One of the things that we've been doing at the AFN is we did an inventory of, we've started an inventory of First Nations and aquaculture in Canada. So far, there's 225 First Nations. And this isn't just finfish, this is shellfish, this is aquaponics, it's a whole range of aquaculture. There is approximately 168 here in BC. There's 40 in Central and 17 in the Atlantic. Now this is quite significant. In 2011, DFO cited only 50 in Canada, First Nations. So there is quite a discrepancy on that as well. So just get heads up, get ready for the Aquaculture Act. We will have an opportunity for engagement and to decide what an aquaculture would need, as well as looking at closed containment, governance, making decisions whether aquaculture should be in your territories. So those are the types of things as chiefs just keep on top of. The Inland Working Group, it doesn't really pertain to this group here, but I just wanted to say in terms of national support, it's so important that we also help our First Nations across the country when there's issues. This Freshwater Fish Marketing Corporation has been problematic for the First Nations in the inland, mostly the prairies and up north. 90% of the First Nation clientele are Indigenous, so they're First Nation fishermen. It has a direct impact on the marketing as well as the processing of the fish products. So the Inland Working Group will be meeting in the future. They're going to be talking about the future. They're going to be also looking at a harvesters-led model for the first time. The Ocean Working Group, there is a lot of action going on there, mostly focused on the marine protected areas as well as marine spatial planning. In the future, they will be talking about oceans governance. So that's another key issue for you coastal First Nations you may want to be apprised of. Regional Chief Terry talked about the CBD. There is a lot of meetings coming up. We did talk that Chief Byron Lewis as well as Ken Paul, the Director of AFN Fisheries, went there. So it's very important that we have a voice. They've shifted into looking at oceans and marine exclusively. So we need strong First Nation voices at these sessions, and there's a lot of dialogue about climate change as well. Looking forward, I mentioned about designing and renewing our strategy based on those 4 pillars: the rights, access, capacity, and accountability. We are looking at we should be getting a discussion paper from Brenda Gartner on the Supreme Court decision. She is going to be assessing all the different cases in fisheries and also giving us options in terms of a mechanism, so we look forward to that. The aquaculture inventories should be complete in the next few weeks. We also have Indigenous knowledge systems and protocol templates, so there'll be workshops in the future on that. One thing I wanted to also mention is that we've developed a UN declaration document, relevant fishery articles. So if anyone wants a copy of that, I noticed that there's a lot of talk about the UN declaration, and so there is a sort of a cheat sheet, a guide, which we could also share. Species and species at risk, especially the aquatic. We don't have an aquatic working group, so we're trying to get that started, as well as looking at food security. And we hope to get Chief Byron Lewis to help us a little bit about the loss of species and doing some of that work with us as well. Once again, I just wanted to recap some of the ongoing issues that have been happening over the last little while. We are looking at a national fisheries forum in 2020 in the spring. There'll be a formal announcement on that, when and where. Over the last few days, I've had the privilege of talking to many chiefs about your serious concerns about the salmon stocks, the Big Bar landslide, DFO enforcement issues, the fish farm diseases, the Supreme Court decision, priority access and implementation of these decisions, as well as some of the climate change and emergencies in fisheries. One of the last things I wanted to mention, the Fishery Committee has also been talking about, is the ability to have some kind of disaster relief when things like this happen and impact our fisheries. So with that, I'll close and allow some time here for Art to give you an update on the Big Bar landslide. Thank you very much. Well, Alan.
While they're setting up the slides, thanks Regional Chief Terry Teegee for inviting me to speak to the Big Bar slide an incident that occurred this summer, and I appreciate it, the opportunity. My name is Gord Starrett. I'm the Executive Director for the Upper Fraser Fisheries Conservation Alliance, and I was also on the Executive Committee for the Fraser River Aboriginal Fisheries Secretariat. And so my initial response to the slide was from an Upper Fraser perspective, but quickly realizing that this was going to be an event that was going to impact everybody, not just Fraser First Nations, Marine Approach First Nations, but BC-wide, people rely on, and family members rely on where they can acquire their fish, and going to different river systems, trade, and that this was bigger than just the Upper Fraser. And so I quickly sort of changed my, well, I didn't change, I just sort of, it was evolved into that really the Fraser River Aboriginal Fisheries Secretariat would be the more appropriate body to participate with the provincial and federal governments on the slide response. And so I'm just going to provide a little bit of some insight on how we became involved, and where this started right from the start, and how this evolved through the whole incident response. So as I mentioned, so a little bit of history on the slide. Around June 23rd, the slide was reported to DFO. It was first discovered around the 21st by a landowner, who then reported it to, actually I believe it was Chief Michelle Edwards, who then passed the message on to a rafting company that went and checked it out. They realized that they couldn't raft through that area, that it was too violent, and that something had to be done. So that's when DFO was contacted, and then who quickly, within a couple of days, had a helicopter, went out and checked it out, and realized that we had a bit of an issue here. And so right from then, when I heard about the slide, made contact with DFO in the province, let them know that First Nations wanted to be involved and had to be involved in this, and got invited to a strategic planning meeting with some of the upper levels within the provincial and federal government, and we started the plan about and determining how this was going to occur with an incident command structure. So that was on July 1st, and then July 2nd, the Joint Executive Steering Committee was struck, and which was started off with Jed Davies from the province, and Bonnie Ancliffe from DFO, and myself for representing First Nations. And really, it was an establishment of a government-to-government relationship that we've probably heard about, that's been iterated throughout this whole process. And so through that was the command structure. We oversee, make decisions on how the incident command, unified command would operate. But input into that was also the establishment of a First Nations leadership panel. And when a decision was being made, or an option was being put forward, whether it was through fishing or if it was land, we had alterations to the land and whatnot, and realizing there's cultural sensitivities there, that we had to go to a First Nations body that could provide direction, endorsement, and decision-making on those options. And so when we had options that we thought were outside of what had already been decided, that we were moving fish over or we were doing rock manipulation, we engaged the First Nations leadership panel to make a decision by consensus. So anyways, from there, so once that was established, we went through, there was rock scaling. I think everybody's probably seen the pictures on the TV about the scalers. There's video online. You can go through the Fraser River Aboriginal Fisheries Secretariat website and see all the photos of the fishing operations and everything. But really, rock scaling, we knew that we had to get down to the river right away and start creating a passage. We've learned this from other incidents, such as the Taltan slide in 2014, and that was the initial response, to get down there and start manipulating rock so that we could move fish up through and let them migrate naturally through the slide area. So from there, things just sort of evolved. We had the rock scalers working on cleaning up the area, making it safe first. Safety was always an issue. It was always a priority. And we started from there. We also started getting fishing operations implemented, and then we had to deal with the Chilcotin flood. It was a 200-year flood event that we had to deal with. We couldn't get down to the water. We couldn't go fishing. So there was a couple weeks there where sort of in a lull. It seemed like we weren't able to do anything. Well, we weren't able to do anything. We couldn't even get into the river, and we couldn't catch fish. People I know fishing on the river and stuff would understand that when you have logs and trees and just violent water, fishing doesn't work very well. We also, some of the things we did was we implemented radio tagging procedures and hydroacoustic so that we could monitor fish that were coming into the area, and then we had upstream hydroacoustics that so we could monitor fish that were going beyond the slide. We know that there was passage before the flood, and we also know that during the flood and after the flood, because of the violent nature of the waters and how they moved rocks and stuff, that we did not have that same passage. That the scaling included things like controlled blasting, maneuvering rock into places where we could drop it down into the river and then create back channels and eddies for the fish to rest in pools so they can work their way up the river. And also engaging, also all the way through this, we also engaged High Bar First Nation, Canoe Creek First Nation, Statliam Eco Resources, the Statliam Nation, and the Split Rock resources to provide archaeology support, fishing support, and I think logistics, and there was a few other things that slipped my mind. One of the, I guess going back a little bit, one of the main things when we started right off the bat was that First Nations leadership up and down the river, even the marine areas, we had First Nations leadership from Washington State come and visit the site, take a helicopter flight, an overview, see the area, sometimes land, talk to the people that were working there. That was instrumental in trying to get the information out and show the magnitude of this whole slide. And without that, you wouldn't be able to grasp it. You wouldn't be able to understand unless you saw it in person. I mean, you could see it TV, and when you saw the scalars down the bottom, you could start to see the size of what we were dealing with, but to actually see it in person really hit home, I think. And there was a lot of somber trips. We'd take First Nations leadership up, talk to them, show them the slide, and then flying back. It was a pretty quiet ride back, understanding of what those fish were up against. And so from there, we continued. We had fishing. As I mentioned, we had First Nations involvement at the Joint Executive Steering Committee. We had First Nations involvement at the Unified Command as incident commanders, logistics, planning, and then fishing. We had seconded a couple of wheels from the Kitsim-Kalim First Nation. We had the Gitsan Kiwanga crews and some of the Hazelton crews come down, expert seine fishermen that are knowledgeable about dealing with those kind of river conditions. And it was just, and we had Lake Babine First Nation fisheries technicians, we had Tlasden Nation fisheries technicians, and it was really a collaborative approach to when First Nations got on the ground. We also had DFO in the province. We had wildfire helping support with helicopter and long lining and stuff like that. Fishing, carrying fish, and loading the buckets. And so it was just, I mean, overall, the collaboration and the work and the understanding and the heart that people put into it on the ground was just overwhelming. So that's with that. I've got these timelines. We did stop fishing a couple weeks ago when we knew we had sufficient natural passage. We're still tagging. We're still making sure that natural passage is there. We're still dealing with coho. We're actually currently dealing with pinks. We know they were swimming through their pretty good numbers a couple weeks ago, or this last week. We got coho actually coming up this next week. Probably do some tagging just to sort of monitor how they get through and they get back to the spawning grounds over the next month as they arrive on their spawning grounds. And then we have interior Fraser steelhead, which are an endangered species. They're not listed by SARA, but they are an endangered species by COSIWIG, and we're gonna have to deal with those as well. And so nobody's going anywhere. Rock manipulation, we'll keep observing, we'll keep monitoring, and watching. And if there's rock manipulation that needs to be done, or if we have to re-implement fisheries to help those fish get by the slide, that's what'll be done. Now that was on that timeline of key events right from the start to pretty much last week, I guess. I don't have an updated one, but this is forward-looking with regards to the future operations. You can see where it sort of shows the greens are fish migration periods, includes pinks and coho that I just discussed, and steelhead. And so September through November, we're still going to be dealing with fish, but we're also realizing that we've got water events. You can see the lines at the bottom, sort of hydrographic lines. Those show the timeline that we have from now until basically April 1st to work and make this and keep working on the slide so that we're not dealing with this again in the same manner next year. But we would be prepared, and the governments would be prepared to implement similar procedures if we had to. But so we're working on heavy equipment. Right now, there's discussion about a road to get to the slide so that we can work on it. But that right now, Canoe Creek First Nation and High Bar yesterday had a discussion. They're meeting with their chief and council to determine whether this is an appropriate option to build a road through that area. There's archaeology interests, and so we're just making sure we're doing our due diligence and that everybody's informed. Once we find out from Canoe and High Bar what their decision is, we'll bring that to the First Nations Leadership Panel again and have that endorsement of those options of moving heavy equipment in. One is a spider hoe, dropping it right over the edge with a winch. That's already actually been approved because it's a bit of the rock manipulation, but some of these other things like bringing the heavy equipment and building the roads a little bit different animal, and so we want to make sure that we've brought that to the First Nations Leadership Panel and made that decision. You can see in the yellow the river icing and hazardous work conditions, but this is the period where the water's low. We can see the rocks in the middle and determine whether we need to go down and actually drill holes in those rocks in the middle of the river when it's a little bit safer and we can actually see them and get on them, and use explosives to remove them from the area. So I'm going to leave it at that. If you have any questions, I'm available for questions for a bit here, and I just thank you for the opportunity, and thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much. Let's thank the panel. We're well over the designated time for this, but again, that's a pretty critical issue. Thank you, Regional Chief. He'll present gifts to Audrey and to Gord for those updates. And we will continue with our fisheries discussion. I'll invite Richard Sparrow, the project manager, Susie Porter-Bob, the project manager, and Chris Stanwyck from Mandel Pender, the First Nations Fisheries Council, to please make their way forward.
Hey, last call and we'll get out of your hair.
Okay.
Winner gets $450.
Last call on the 50-50. Winners share more than $450.
Last call.
Last call, just around the corner. I'll be right there. I just have to finish introducing this panel. All right, so again, just in order of our business, we'll finish up the Fisheries Council work. We do have the Economic Development and Sustainable Economic Development and Fiscal Relations presentation. A reminder of the materials that are available for you, the toolkits, I'll call them. And then we will spend the remainder of our day finishing up the resolutions. We do have 12 of those, 11 of those left, and there were no late resolutions, so we're in a pretty good shape. We do want to try to finish those today, so we need your cooperation for that. Let us turn it over to the panel. I'm not sure, microphone 5 or 6? 5 is here, that's 6 there? 6.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Richard Sparrow, working with the First Nations Fisheries Council and their natural resource manager. I'd just like to acknowledge all the chiefs, elders, leaders, and good friends in the room. Does this sound weird? I know that we're a time crunch, so just quickly just wanted to introduce a few items before I hand it over to our colleagues. I reflect and remind myself constantly of the First Nations Fisheries Council mandate that's the First Nations Leadership Council recognized that First Nations were speaking in a very fragmented voice regarding fisheries. First Nations really need to continue to establish collaborative processes around all aspects of fisheries, working together to make meaningful changes and advance Aboriginal interests around fisheries. Collaboration is at times really should be prioritized within our local watersheds, and as well exploring opportunities of working with neighboring nations beyond the watersheds that we reside in. Recently, the First Nations Fisheries Council distributed through our email distribution, a series of links and hyperlinks that provided some information regarding the federal commitment around their reconciliation strategy. So I really encourage you folks, if you didn't receive that information, to seek that out or to contact us, and we're able to provide that information to you folks. It really to me is a really fundamental and important aspect for us as First Nations people to really putting the Department of Fisheries and Oceans on notice and seeking that clarity regarding what the reconciliation strategy is and how it's going to be implemented and incorporated into discussions with First Nations around fisheries management moving forward. I reflect back to Chief Terry Teegee's update just a few moments ago. There was a lot of concerns and issues around fisheries matters, and at times it really seems endless and a really daunting task. So once again, we really need to identify processes, collaborative approaches to advance First Nations interests, really coming together and working with one another and showcasing to DFO specifically on fisheries that First Nations have established processes, mechanisms for engaging in dialogue around Aboriginal interests in fisheries. This year in particular, First Nations have been experiencing extreme difficulties around returns of salmon, not just in the Fraser River, but other systems, local watersheds. I've had the opportunity of working up in the Skeena quite a bit over the past couple of years, and the Skeena, as well as the Fraser and other systems along the coast, have been experiencing very low returns. So once again, I think it's very important for us to come together, establish those collaborative processes, and not only amongst First Nations, but really encouraging federal and provincial government to come to the table and have a common voice when we're speaking to fisheries managers moving forward. A common resource that is often discussed and relates to fish is water. Without water, we don't have fish. Water is experiencing extreme difficulties as well in terms of climate change, the demand of water. Fish are experiencing extreme challenges relating to water, whether it's in terms of high water temperatures in various times of the year in various systems, and as well as water flows. So I'll turn it over to our colleagues. They'll speak a little bit more specifically to water. And is it good? Thanks.
Masicho Richard, and I just want to also acknowledge being here on Musqueam territory, and also just thank you for making time on the agenda for us to talk a little bit about the work I've done over the past few months alongside the Fisheries Council. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Chris Statnick. I am a lawyer at Mandel Pinder, and I'm Vuntagwitchin with my family from Old Crow, Yukon. What we're coming to speak to you today about is a resolution being put forward around a recommendation report that was developed by a working group made up of First Nations leaders and staff from across BC with experience on water governance and management issues. And I participate mostly in a facilitation role. But really what the working group was putting their minds towards was in the context of the Provincial Water Sustainability Act, which folks might recall was passed by BC back in 2016. In the context of that act and the remaining regulations and policies that are to be developed under it, what would it mean to actually put into action and implementation the BC government's recent commitments towards supporting self-determination, including through implementing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the Chilcotin Decision on Aboriginal Title and Rights. You know, I think most people in this room will be familiar with the context of when the Water Sustainability Act was passed in 2016, the way that the province engaged with First Nations was not well received. There's many concerns with how that consultation and engagement was carried out. And then when it came to the substance of the Water Sustainability Act that did come into force, there was really a lack of engagement with you know, Indigenous rights and Indigenous people's relationship to water. And so with, you know, given that water is so significant to all of our communities, and we all have rights and responsibilities related to water in our territories and that flows through our territories, the potential for potential impacts to rights as well as to the watersheds themselves is quite significant. And so with that context, the working group over a series of meetings, including with the staff from the province's Ministry of Environment and Climate Change Strategy, worked towards developing recommendations of what would it mean to, like I said, co-develop the remaining regulations and policies under the Water Sustainability Act. And so that's what the materials, I think, that were circulated, you can dig into fully the report itself. This resolution or a similar resolution around these recommendations has been, I guess, endorsed by resolution by the union as well as the summit earlier this summer. And really the mandate or the marching orders to carry forward with this type of work and think about what co-development could look like came from resolutions passed by the summit, the union, and BCAFN back in 2017 and 2018. Another piece of helpful context here, I guess, is that the act that was passed in 2016 contemplates regulations being developed in, I guess, a staged approach. And the province has indicated that they see sort of the remaining regulations being developed under that act over the course of the next 3 to 4 years. And again, like I mentioned, there is this potential for significant impact of these laws on rights and title. And so when we got the working group together, the starting point was really how would water governance and management in BC look like if title and rights and Indigenous self-determination was actually acknowledged and respected rather than ignored or denied. You know, the context and the reality is the regulation of water in BC over its history. First Nations have largely been alienated from access to water, its uses, and its exercise of its jurisdictions, laws, title rights, and knowledge systems haven't been recognized or respected. And so the working group felt very strongly that moving forward in developing new law and policy around water, particularly now with the commitments that the province has made, that the manner in which those laws and policies develop needs to be fundamentally different. And it needs to be established and maintained through collaboration and consent-based decision-making. So you'll see up there on the slide there, the recommendations that the working group ended up coming to after their deliberations and work and in meetings with the ministry staff. And one of the things that immediately came up was the fact that we have this existing act developed in 2016, which is really the foundation for which all regulations and policies under it must ultimately be consistent with. And unlike, for example, the new BC Environmental Assessment Act that you're all familiar with, it doesn't have any references to UNDRIP in that in the Water Sustainability Act, or really any contemplation of the place for title and rights in this discussion. And so resetting the relationship on based on recognition and respect, what the working group meant by that is you can't just skirt over the existing act and move to developing these remaining regulations. You actually need to also reset the foundations in the act based on that proper foundation of recognition and respect. So that was the first recommendation. The second one was to ensure that adherence to UNDRIP moving forward. And so the relevant minimum standards in UNDRIP should be guiding the content and the substance of those laws, but also the way in which those laws are developed and brought into effect. The third recommendation that the working group also felt strongly about was, given that the underlying goal in all of this is supporting Indigenous self-determination, which includes supporting Indigenous peoples in enacting and exercising their own laws around water, that this really needs to be a relationship that's not strictly focused on developing a provincial law. It also needs to be mindful that Indigenous peoples also have laws relevant to the governance and management of water in BC, and there needs to be a way to promote, those to exist in a more harmonious way, and that those laws on themselves are given greater respect on their own. The fourth recommendation was really then about, if we were going to get into a more collaborative approach to developing regulation and policy with the province, what are some models of how that could take place? And this discussion really started with the deficiencies of sort of the existing consultation and engagement practices of the province. You're all familiar, when the 2016 Act was, when consultation was happening on that, I think you all remember, it was a letter to each individual band that came from the province, basically inviting written comments. There was an ability, I think, to provide comments on an online portal, but the extent of engagement was limited to that. And so the working group really talked about the deficiencies of that approach, and the need to really find other models that are actually trying to implement, consent-based decision-making and consensus building. So they identified really 4 options or models that they were prepared to recommend, with sort of the important overlying statement that neither one of these options is going to be a model that works for everyone. One option shouldn't limit the other, and that you should be able to participate in them to the extent you want, even not at all. The 4 options were participation through existing or emerging First Nations Crown processes. And this is really fundamentally about supporting self-determination, where First Nations and the provincial Crown already have established or agreed to processes or ways that they're going to make decisions together or collaborate together. So Many First Nations in the province have existing collaboration agreements or reconciliation agreements. Some not related to water, others, just other decision-making processes. Others are working to establish new agreements in the near future that might guide how you might make decisions together. Others already have, a treaty relationship with the province and sort of existing forums where collaboration on regulations and policies could take place. So this model is to say where that's established and the First Nation wants that discussion to happen at that nation-to-nation level or government-to-government level, you should be supporting that. And that's actually the pattern of relationships that you should be working to get to with everyone over time where they aren't established. So that was the first recommendation, or the first proposed model, is where you have a table, where you have a forum already, see if that's a place where collaboration can take place. The second one was developing this idea of a First Nation water caucus. There's a separate slide on that, which will give you a visualization of just what that could look like. But the idea was not everyone has the capacity or sometimes interest to engage extensively on collaboration of regulations and policies at that government-to-government or nation-to-nation level. Other governments have large priorities that they also need to put their resources towards. So the idea of there being a more delegated structure from First Nations where people with the technical expertise, but also Indigenous knowledge around water and water management could be have a more focused forum with the province to more get into the nitty-gritty of actual drafting and developing what regulations say and how they operate. So that caucus structure would sort of allow delegated representatives to have that level of collaboration. And then the latter two here, participation through regional advisory workshops and participation through a process of First Nation submissions. These were more than models that I think most people are familiar with on sort of more widespread consultations that the province has conducted. And the working group acknowledged that the way that those models have been implemented in the past, they've been limited to those options largely. And there's still ways that those models can be improved upon. And you don't want to eliminate them entirely, the working group felt, because they are one important way that First Nations can bring forward individual concerns and comments and proposals to the province. So the idea of regional advisory workshops was that you would have workshops in different regions of the province, but over a more sustained period of time. So it's not just one day and here's an information dump and we've already developed all the policy questions we want to talk to you about, but a more actual collaborative dialogue that happens at these workshops where input is actually being substantially considered and addressed with the right people in the room. And then First Nation submissions is exactly what I think most people are familiar with. The ability to provide extensive written submissions to the province on discrete topics being developed under regulation and policy. And the working group in the report did highlight ways that this could be improved, just in terms of providing more advance notice, providing more support in terms of resources to allow First Nations to develop comments and proposals and submissions, and also a way to track other people's submissions, so a more transparent way to review others' submissions and understand how exactly the province is responding to those or not.
maintaining those models of engagement, but seeking to improve them. The fifth recommendation was about making sure that participation begins at the very outset of when even just policy issues, like what is the policy issue that we're trying to address, is being defined. Often, I think many experience consultation happening at a stage where the government has already framed the policy issues, and many times they're too far down a policy approach that hasn't considered important questions about title and rights. So beginning at the early outset of policy development and regulation development, and that's, you know, whether it's participating at the Water Caucus level or requesting submissions, that needs to happen at the very outset of policy development. And that this collaboration and engagement doesn't just need to happen early, but it needs to happen throughout all stages of policy and regulation development. You know, it's a really important part of the right of free, prior, informed consent is that it's an ongoing right through every aspect of decision making that can affect you. I'm just going to wrap up here with the final two recommendations. Increasing or improving transparency in decision making. Again, this goes back to the working group's experience of, you know, spending your limited time and resources on engagement, putting the time and care to prepare submissions and comments, and then not really, you know, having them kind of go up in the black box and not really knowing how exactly they were considered or addressed. And if they haven't been, then why? Why is it that those haven't been addressed? And so the working group really talked about throughout engagement, improving transparency all the way through policy development. So it's clear how input is being addressed or not. The final recommendation, of course, is around sufficient, stable, and predictable resources. The fact is that collaboration, you know, meaningful collaboration at a government level on a consent basis is going to take more time than typical than the province is used to in terms of engaging, and so they really need to invest. Not just in supporting through financial resources, but also developing the human resources that are required to engage in this type of intensive, at times, exercise. They can also be quite technical at times just because of the nature of the subject matter. And the working group was clear in this recommendation that it's not just resources towards again, engagement in some provincial process, but also this larger goal of supporting self-determination. So there needs to be resources towards Indigenous law revitalization, towards, you know, First Nations developing their own laws and policies for how they would like to see water governed and managed in their territory. Here's the slide from the, I believe it's in the working group report, just around potentially what they envisioned that water caucus looking like. But you can see there, you know, that it contemplates, you know, a very technical engagement, but with a delegated structure and the political mandate to support it. And you'll see there the policy development cycle on the bottom of that diagram. This is basically the stages of regulation and policy development as modified by this proposed water caucus model. And again, just wanted to stress that the working group report is clear that, you know, no single option, you know, including this water caucus, is going to be the only model. That there needs to be support for all these different ways of engaging. These were also key steps for implementation. And so these were, the working group had these broader recommendations, but then they put some recommendations for a more immediate action that the province could take around this subject and around the recommendations in the report. You'll see there, demonstrate UNDRIP standards. So asking the province to demonstrate that, yes, UNDRIP is going to be the standard moving forward in the development of regulation and policy. I know you heard the presentation yesterday around the UNDRIP legislation. I mean, there's one demonstration of a commitment towards UNDRIP, but it's now needs to start informing the nitty-gritty work of actual law and regulation and policy development. So you'll see there, yeah, also the commitment to align with the future provincial reconciliation legislation or UNDRIP legislation, so that any part of implementing UNDRIP is going to have to be looking at existing provincial law and policy and how it conforms to UNDRIP or not. And so committing to aligning to that process of making laws conform to UNDRIP. Endorsement of a collaborative development process, so right away endorsing that, yes, we actually want to develop these things together. We also asked to conduct an environmental scan, basically to look at what it is that you're already doing. We want to find efficiencies because I think people have experienced recently, engagement on so many initiatives that it's hard to keep up. So trying to find the efficiencies where they can exist in implementing these recommendations. And then again, identifying the fiscal and human resources that are going to be required to implement the recommendations. So I know the resolution will be coming before you guys shortly, but just to indicate, like I mentioned, the recommendations have been endorsed earlier by the Assembly of the Summit and the Union earlier this summer, and an endorsement from this Assembly as well would send, I think, a strong signal to the province that these recommendations are widely supported, and the work towards implementing collaborative development of regulation and policy in this area around water governance and management needs to begin on this basis. So I'll close my comments there, and if people have questions, happy to answer.
I just wanted to double check. I know Susie hasn't spoken yet. Are you, you're good? All right, with that, just in the interest of time, officially you would have more time, but if we could, we'll perhaps move to the resolution. And on this particular resolution, which is 23 with the BC Water Sustainability Act Engagement Framework, that is a mirrored resolution, which means that is a resolution that has been passed by either UBCIC or the First Nations Summit or both. And so you are asked to support that. There are 4 other resolutions like that in your package that are mirrored resolutions, which would be Resolution 14, implementation of recommendations from the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. 16, the BC First Nations Cannabis Framework and Action Plan. 19, First Nations Children and Youth in Care Education Strategy. And 21, Minerals on Reserve Reform. And just in the interest of time and the fact that those are mirrored, we'd like to take those as an omnibus package. I do have Chief Don Tom, who is willing to move that. Could I get a seconder? Grand Chief and Proxy Doug Kelly to second that. And so noting that those are the 5 in the omnibus mirrored resolution package, 14, 16, 19, 21, and 23. They all together have 17, therefore be it resolved. So I'm happy to note that your procedure does not require me to read them. And as much as I was looking forward to going through the 22 whereases in the Sustainability Act's resolution, let us move to this discussion if we could. So moved and seconded a omnibus to adopt 5 mirrored resolutions. Is there a need for discussion on any of those 5 resolutions? Seeing none, are there any abstentions, or is there any objections to this omnibus package, the mirrored package? Seeing none, are there any abstentions to the mirrored omnibus package? Seeing none, then the how many bus resolution contains 5 on this particular bus. All right, so that is adopted by acclamation. Thank you very much for that, ladies and gentlemen. We have 5 remaining resolutions, or 6 remaining resolutions. However, we do have one other presentation before we get to that, and we do want to turn briefly to the Sustainable Economic Development and Fiscal Relations Strategy update. Regional Chief. Give away some money?
Anyway,
Just one?
yeah, winner gets 500.
Winner gets 250, I get the other half.
This is the 50-50?
Yeah. All proceeds to revitalize canoe in the community.
All proceeds to revitalize the canoe group.
Yeah, in the back, you should check if there's a name.
No name.
Number, then.
370-7157. So the last 4 digits, 7157. There's no name on the back.
We'll go announce outside, there's some winners.
It's,
Oh,
well, that's $500.
we'll go announce it outside.
Okay.
If there's nobody out there, we'll come back and draw them.
Okay. Can we get the sustainable economic development slides up? What was the number again? 7157. Pretty sure it's you? I'd go get it. I'll go get it, or, otherwise it's going to be a 30, 20, 50 split. All right, let us turn our attention to the presentation.
Thank you. Hello? Thank you, Harold. So first of all, I just want to acknowledge the Territory Musqueam people and say thank you. So this slide deck and this presentation is in regards to the Champions Table and the BC Business Council. The BCAFN has an arrangement with, and in regards to the initiatives that we're doing at the Champions Table. Right now we have an internship program with Vancouver Island University, and right now we're looking for some students who have graduated to be placed into the program as an intern. And we'd like to thank the Minister, Melanie Mark, for her contribution to this program. And there was approximately $400,000 that were brought forward to this program last fall, and it continues on. The second initiative is a pilot project with Atsilcoteen, and Councillor Percy Guichon will update us on that initiative. The other project we've been working on over the last several years is the Black Books. The reason we called it Black Books is get out of the red and into profit and more Black Books in terms of get out of the red ink, and it's an economic development toolkit for our First Nations communities to really, I think what it is to allow for our First Nations communities to look at different places where they can seek help in terms of economic development. This year we do have a couple of business forums. One that is scheduled here right after the World Indigenous Business Forum. The World Indigenous Business Forum is from, I believe, from October 8th to 10th here at the Convention Center, in Vancouver. And on October 11th, we have the BCAFN Business Forum, which will be at the Western Wall Center downtown. And we have several policy papers that we will be working on as well as part of this initiative. The MOU was signed in 2017 with the province of British Columbia, and really the Champions Table is 11 members from the BC Business Council, many of them CEOs, and 11 from the British Columbia Assembly First Nations chiefs and economic development leaders. And I myself and the president of BC Business Council, Greg Diavian, co-chair this initiative, and really creates unique space to discuss these issues that we're dealing with. One of the first matters that we brought up was the implementation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and how business can really adopt the recommendations, the 94 recommendations, and implement them. And to enlighten us and more on the Silcotin pilot project, I pass the floor on to Percy Gichel.
Thank you, Chief Terry.
6. Microphone 6.
Hello? Can you hear me? Zonaskuwan Guzun. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Percy Gichel. I'm a member of the Tsailil First Nation and part of the Silcotin Nation. Also a business development manager for Tsailil Enterprise. It's a joint venture logging and a company with Toko Industries in Williams Lake. And also I'm a board member on the Central Chilcotin Rehabilitation company that we established with Chief Joe Alphonse of his community of Tlatinco. He sends his regrets that he was not able to make it here today. Just wanted to give you a quick background on my community, working with Chief Joe's community. We formed this joint venture, CCR, just before the wildfires of 2017. And we started the company to access some funding through Forest Enhancement Society of BC. And the main objective was to develop a project to mitigate the threat of wildfires to the communities and also protect the forest resource in our traditional territories. And two communities also wanted to create sustained employment in forest development planning activities and harvesting, rehabilitation, and reforestation. And our project proposal was successful, and CCR received multi-year funding of over $23 million, and CCR is the largest non-government recipient of FES-BC funding in BC. And so in meeting their objectives, we harvested low volume and uneconomical forest stands and targeted these stands to improve the low value forests and to contribute to the fiber supply from these forests. After we completed the first year of the project, CCR decided to build on the success, and we are now in the process of improving utilization of biomass and reducing the amount of carbon emissions. So now we're moving in the direction of creating sustainable business by utilizing the pulpwood left over in the harvesting process and doing some chipping and grinding, et cetera, to, for the pellet and the cogeneration and pulp markets. So as everyone knows, this summer was a difficult one in the forest industry. Heard that mentioned a few times earlier today. And most of the logging companies in the Caribou and Chilcotin region did not work due to mill curtailments and shutdowns. But because we diversified into pulpwood and biomass, site-led enterprise and CCR were able to continue logging and keep most of our employees and contractors working. And unfortunately, the outlook for forest industry is that it's going to get much, much worse before it gets better. So in working with the Champions Table, it's an opportune time for the Tsilhqot'in Nation to work with industry and other First Nations and be innovative and create more sustainable economic development opportunities. So the pilot project with Tsilhqot'in committed to advance a project that is based on our needs, what we want to advance, and acknowledges and puts our project in a strong position due to the tidal lands that we hold. We have started with identifying and reviewing the opportunities and barriers, and more importantly, what we would be interested in related to an economic project. Working solely between the leaders at the Champions Table, the CEOs and First Nation leadership, we have a chance to explore this without the government at the table. So now we've identified a couple opportunities and been able to hear from some experts related to these areas, with our next step being to continue with a tangible plan of action for implementation. BCAFN will work to capture learnings through this process in order to share with other First Nations from our experience. Next slide. So the outcome of this pilot program will be an economic development strategy for the Tsilhqot'in Nation that includes a shared decision-making model. It is hoped that this model can be used by other businesses and First Nations when conducting economic development activities on First Nation territories. And we will document the process undertaken in this pilot and develop at ground level how-to playbook that is a best practice that other businesses can look at and get an understanding of how to initiate conversations and proceed through the project stage. This case could be added to the BCAFN Economic Development Toolkit that Chief Terry mentioned earlier as a best practice to demonstrate a tangible example of shared decision-making to show investors that projects can happen in BC with First Nations as true decision-making partners. Next slide. So before handing it back over to Chief Terry, I just wanted to inform those that are interested that there is some background information available at the back regarding the Tsilhqot'in Nation strategy session that we held on March 15th, and there's some information on the concept paper regarding the economic development strategy pilot project itself that lays out the work plan. And also we're pursuing a carbon credit initiative project, and there's some information on that also, and just some key points around nature-based solutions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Percy. So as I mentioned, we do have the black books, and I'm not sure if we have copies here, but we do. And if you are interested with some of these economic development sustainability roadmap, I just want to thank For Directions, Dan George, for putting on these forums over the last couple of years. We went out, there were 4 meetings, different regions, and once again, before we completed these books, they were vetted by some of our First Nations experts in economic development, Michelle Corfield, Mark Palasley, Caroline Hilton, and really supported and looked at how this can be utilized by First Nations communities. And realizing that all our communities have different situations. Approximately 10 to 15% First Nations communities are within urban areas, so you have different priorities versus the vast majority, 85% of our First Nations communities are in rural areas, so we have different challenges, those First Nations. Some of the key themes are First Nations had vibrant economies prior to contact, and really I think we need to revive those, the economies and also those trade routes. And it's one of the things that I'm working on to create trade networks with other Indigenous communities outside of Canada, including the United States, perhaps New Zealand. One of the biggest comments that came out of all the forums was the assertion of rights, title, and treaty rights. And that's essential for our economies to flourish. And really develop our own institution and regimes that what is creating our own, really our own foundations in regards to economic development, and our own people to take up these roles in economic development. And one of the things that comes back to the United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous People is the emphasis on our decision-making structures and creating our own economic self-sufficiency, which would be recognized within the United Nations, the many articles within the United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Our next steps are, perhaps you can access some copies that we do have here, but it is on our website as well. The distribution of the Black Books. And we'll have a rollout in different regions for the Black Books. As I said, we do have an economic development forum in October 11th, and I believe we'll have one more bigger meeting in February, I believe, in Prince George. And further to this, I'd like to think of these books as evergreen, meaning that we can add to it and make it as best as we can, so it reflects your issues as First Nations practitioners. So the business forum is reawakening Indigenous trade, really reawakening our trade routes that was here pre-contact, and our economic relationships, especially in this area of reconciliation. What does that look like? And this business forum is on October 11th at the Western Bayshore, and January 31st, I should say. January 31st in Prince George next year. And here are a list of the many policy papers that we're working on right now. Indigenous trade. We're looking at owned utilities. We're really looking at what does that look like if we have our own infrastructure in regards to utilities. Financing First Nations projects, labor market projections. We have an increasing population, a very young demographic that can take up those spaces. Free, prior, and informed consent in business. What does that look like if we are adopting the declaration? Paper on forestry, and much of that work is with the First Nations Forestry Council. Mining, energy, technology, tourism, gaming, cannabis. Cannabis is working with the Cannabis Working Group, which is in partnership with the province of BC. Sports and recreation, and First Nations economic and commercial fisheries. So these are the many papers that we're working on right now, and certainly would appreciate some of your input on some of these matters as well. So with that, I end our presentation, and just want to thank you all for being here till the end of the day. So thank you, and I pass the floor on to Harold. Masai.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. Thank you very much, Chiefs and Proxies. We have 5 resolutions before us to finish up before the end of the day, and according to our schedule, we have 22 minutes to do that. And I have faith in you. We have resolutions 15, 17, 18, 20, 24, and 25 remaining. So let us turn our attention to addressing the criminalization and over-incarceration of Indigenous women and girls. I'll need a mover and seconder for this resolution. 15. Doug Kelly, seconder. Charles Morvan. Therefore be it resolved, the BCAFN Chiefs in Assembly call upon Canada and British Columbia to wholly reform the federal and provincial justice systems in partnership with First Nations, including but not limited to the development of further alternatives to incarceration, recognition, and resourcing for Indigenous justice models in courts, and the development of more healing lodges for Indigenous women under Section 84, Corrections and Conditional Release Act, in order to address the over-incarceration and criminalization of Indigenous women and girls. 2, BCAFN Chiefs in Assembly calls upon the Correctional Services of Canada to ensure that GLADU reports are not being used to determine custodial risk in the federal prison system. 3, BCAFN Chiefs in Assembly calls upon Canada to ensure that the writing of GLADU's reports is consistently funded and resourced across all provinces, and to undertake a review of their application by the judiciary. 4, the BC Chiefs in Assembly calls upon Canada to amend the criminal code to allow judicial discretion in mandatory minimum sentences and to determine a sentence that is based upon the specific circumstances of the offense and the individual. 5, the BC Chiefs in Assembly direct the BCAFN to work with the Union of BC Indian Chiefs and the First Nations Summit as the First Nations Leadership Council and the First Nations Justice Council to develop a strategy for addressing the over-incarceration and criminalization of Indigenous women and girls, and to ensure this strategy is included in the BC First Nations Justice Strategy. And 6, BCAFN Chiefs in Assembly directs the First Nations Justice Council to provide an update on the progress made to address the over-incarceration and criminalization of Indigenous women and girls at the BCAFN Special Chiefs Assembly in 2020. Is there a need for a discussion of Resolution 15? Seeing none, having the question being called, is there any objections to Resolution 15? Seeing none, are there any abstentions? Seeing none, Resolution 15 is adopted by acclamation. Let us turn our attention to Resolution 17, call to action to cease the removal of newborns from hospitals. I'll need a mover and seconder for that resolution. Microphone 10.
Chief Donna Aljam, Nickman Indian Bat.
Chief Ajam, you moved. Seconder. Chief Christian. Cook B. Tristan. Therefore be it resolved that the BCAFN Chiefs in Assembly fully support First Nations in the exercise of their inherent rights of self-determination and self-government, and their inherent right to care for their children, youth, and families. 2, the BCAFN Chiefs in Assembly direct the BC Regional Chief, working with the Union of BC Indian Chiefs and the First Nations Summit as the First Nations Leadership Council, to advocate for a comprehensive strategy to immediately address and cease the practice of removing newborns from their parents as First Nations transition to the resumption of their full and inherent jurisdiction over child and family services. 3, the BCAFN Chiefs in Assembly directs the BC Regional Chief, working with the Union of BC Indians Chiefs and the First Nations Summit as the First Nations Leadership Council, to call upon British Columbia to take concrete and immediate actions to address the cultural and systemic bias toward Indigenous mothers and families, including increased accountability measures for social workers and healthcare professionals. And 4, the BCAFN Chiefs in Assembly direct the BC Regional Chief, working with the Union of BC Indian Chiefs and the First Nations Summit as the First Nations Leadership Council, to call upon Canada and BC to develop and implement a strategic funding strategy with a focus on prenatal and prevention services for new and expected Indigenous parents. Is there a need for discussion of Resolution 17? Seeing none, having heard the question, are there any objections to Resolution 17? Seeing none, are there any abstentions to Resolution 17? Seeing none, Resolution 17 is adopted by acclamation. Let us turn our attention to Resolution 18, support for First Nations Leadership Council Memorandum of Understanding with the Representative for Children and Youth of British Columbia. I'll need a mover and seconder for that. Chief Lewis, Chief Blackwater, thank you. Therefore be it resolved that the BCAFN Chiefs in Assembly fully support First Nations in the exercise of their inherent rights of self-determination and self-government, and their inherent right to care for their children, youth, and families. The BC Chiefs in Assembly directs the BC Regional Chief, working with the Union of BC Indian Chiefs and the First Nations Summit as the First Nations Leadership Council, to advocate for a comprehensive strategy to immediately address and cease the practice of removal. Oh, did I go there? I went the wrong way on that. Sorry about that. Restating. Therefore be it resolved that the BCAFN Chiefs in Assembly direct the BC Regional Chief to support the attached draft memorandum of understanding between the BC Assembly of First Nations Summit, and the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, working collectively as the First Nations Leadership Council and the representative for Children and Youth, and direct the BC Regional Chief to sign on behalf of the BC Assembly of First Nations, and to the BCAFN Chiefs in Assembly direct the BC Regional Chief, working with the First Nations Summit and the Union of BC Indian Chiefs as the First Nations Leadership Council and the representative for Children and Youth, to provide regular reports to the BCAFN Chiefs in Assembly on the ongoing collaboration objectives and efforts as identified in the attached memorandum of understanding. Is there any need for discussion of this resolution? Seeing none, having heard the question, are there any objections to this resolution? Seeing none, are there any abstentions to Resolution 18? Seeing none, then Resolution 18, support for the Memorandum of Understanding with the RCY, is adopted by acclamation. Let us turn our attention to Resolution 20, call for immediate, meaningful, and substantive engagement of First Nations in BC Hydro's Phase 2 review, moved by Chief Councillor Charles Morvan. Second, I know I'll need a seconder for this, Chief Blackwater. Therefore be it resolved that the BCAFN Chiefs in Assembly direct the BCAFN Regional Chief, working with the Union of BC Indian Chiefs and the First Nations Summit as the First Nations Leadership Council, and with the support of the First Nations Energy and Mining Council, to call on the Government of British Columbia to immediately overhaul the terms of reference of Phase 2 of the comprehensive review of BC Hydro currently underway, such that there is meaningful and substantive engagement by First Nations and by representative First Nations organizations at all levels of the review, and that the Phase 2 review recognizes and upholds our inherent and constitutionally protected Indigenous title rights and treaty rights, and engage BC Hydro in Phase 2 comprehensive review under the revisions to the terms of reference, and with the understanding that the First Nations Leadership Council is not an Aboriginal title and rights or treaty rights holder and cannot engage in processes to establish and provide free, prior, and informed consent on behalf of individual First Nations. Is there a need for discussion of this resolution? Microphone 16.
Thank you. I just wanted some clarifications on the second paragraph. Is BCAFN to work with BC to revise the terms of reference? Is that all they're wanting to do, or to do more than that?
Chief Morgan? 14 or? Are we talking about this, the first bullet point in the therefore be it resolved?
That's right.
That's right. Call on the Government of British Columbia to immediately overhaul the terms of reference of Phase 2. As it's written, it is to merely call for it. It doesn't talk about participation.
The second one says to engage with BC, and that's my question, is are they engaging basically to change the terms of reference, or is it to actually go do everything for Phase 2? Is it comprehensive, or is it just the terms of reference?
Yeah, so just looking at the wording, engage BC Hydro in Phase 2 comprehensive review, comma, under the revisions to the terms of reference, comma. That's the mover or the regional chief to address that.
I believe the point being is that they need to overhaul the terms of reference in order to properly engage not only the BCAFN but also yourselves as advocating on your First Nations community's behalf. I think that's what we're calling for.
Okay, I just didn't know if it was comprehensive, that you wanted to do the whole review of the of the BC Hydro review, or are you just going to look at the terms of reference?
If you
It's
want me
unclear.
to. No, I'm just
No.
kidding.
Okay, I'm good if that's all it means. I just wanted that clarification. I don't know if you can do any wording that, but yeah, I know if you can advocate and change those terms of reference, that'd be great.
Awesome. Any further discussion of this resolution? Let us move to the question then. Is there any opposition to the resolution 20? Seeing none, are there any abstentions? Seeing none, then resolution 20 is adopted by acclamation. Let us move our attention to resolution 24, appointment to the Wild Salmon Summit Committee. I'll need a mover and seconder for this. Chief Byron Lewis, seconder. Don Tom, Chief Don Tom. I also saw Chief Spahan, thank you. Therefore be it resolved. So there's a couple pieces to this, that the BCAFN Chiefs and Assembly directs the BC Assembly of First Nations, working with the Union of BC Indian Chiefs and the First Nations Summit as the First Nations Leadership Council, to work to secure funds to support the Political Steering Committee on Wild Salmon, and to work with First Nations Fishery Council to provide staff for this committee. Just noting that the Political Steering Committee on Wild Salmon was approved at a previous Resolution 14, 2018. And then the other pieces of this, the BCAFN Chiefs and Assembly appoint the following political representative to the Political Steering Committee on Wild Salmon. So we'll need a nomination for that, and we'll also need a nomination for the technical representative to the Political Steering Committee. Is there a nomination or a volunteer to serve on as a political representative to the Political Steering Committee on Wild Salmon? Don Tom, you're just going to, Chief Tom, you're going to look at that. Chief Spahan? Microphone 19.
I would like to put Chief James Hobart name up.
So Chief James Hobart as the political representative to the political Steering Committee on Wild Salmon, correct, Chief Hobart? Did I see another hand? Back to Chief Don Tom at microphone 17.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to nominate Colleen Jacob.
To the political representative?
Yes.
Colleen Jacob. Colleen Jacob agrees. And Chief McLeod at microphone 19, you're good? All right, so we have two names for the political representative, Chiefs James Hobart and Colleen Jacob.
You're deaf, including having a blind spot.
Oh, sorry. Microphone 8.
I was pounding the table to get your attention. I'm going to nominate Tyrone McNeil, Tribal Chief, for the political role.
Okay. All right, so we in Tyrone, yes. All right, so we have 3. There's 1 slot there. Are we required to pick 1? Chief Hobart, microphone 19.
I'd like to, being that I'm already busy, I would like to, I know that we're in good hands either way, so I'm going to just decline. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So between Colleen Jacob and Tyrone McNeil, is there a discussion to be had, or shall we do a show of hands? I think what we did yesterday was they determined one would be the political rep and one would be the technical rep. Okay, rep and alternate. Is that workable? And is that something you're prepared to agree to now, or that is something you will work out? So that's a thumbs up to work out? All right, so then the resolution is that the following are appointed as political representatives, Colleen Jacob and Tyrone McNeil, and the member versus alternate will be sorted out between them. Thank you very much for that. We do need to move to number 3, where therefore be resolved number 3, the BCAFN Chiefs in Assembly appoints the following technical representative to the Political Steering Committee on Wild Salmon. Is there a nomination for the technical representative? Or a volunteer? Can we volunteer Jordan Point? So pending acceptance, perhaps we'll do it that way. So that, unless there's someone else in the room who would like to nominate or for the technical representative to the Political Steering Committee on Wild Salmon, at this point we would have Jordan Point as the Executive Director pending his confirmation. If that's acceptable, we'll proceed on that basis. All right, and then, well, with that then, so this resolution and therefore be resolved are filled, and I will look for further discussion on this resolution. Seeing none, let us move to the question. Are there any objections to this resolution on the appointment to the Wild Salmon Committee? If not, are there any abstentions? Seeing none, then this particular resolution, number 24, is adopted by acclamation, noting the clarification to be made by the two political representatives and the confirmation with the technical representative. And let us turn our attention to Resolution 25, the last on-time resolution in your package. Support for First Nations Policing Program as an essential service. I see Chief McLeod is present in the room. Chief Samahalta, are you available? There he is. Thank you, Aaron. All right, being present, making sure I'm going in the right direction on these resolutions. Therefore, be it resolved that the BCAFN Chiefs in Assembly directed the regional chief to call upon the Government of Canada to classify the First Nations Policing Program as an essential service, to develop a legislative basis for the First Nations Policing Program with First Nations, and fund Indigenous policing services at a level that is equitable with non-Indigenous police services in this country, including the provision of funds to close the gap. And two, the BCAFN Chiefs in Assembly direct the regional chief to call upon the Government of British Columbia to meet its commitments to fund the First Nations Policing Program as outlined in community tripartite agreements. Is there any need for discussion of this resolution? Seeing none, are there any, microphone 12, Tyrone?
Thanks, Harold. Tyrone McNeil, Seaward Island. Speaking in support of the resolution, just a recommendation on the first therefore, Harold, where it speaks to policing services at a level that is equitable with non-Indigenous police services. There's a lot of room for interpretation there. It might be one officer for every 1,500 people, for example, in terms of equity. I think through Cindy's work, they coined the term substantive equality. Now, that speaks more to the result of services as opposed to the services provided. So you may want to consider replacing that is equitable with substantive equality or similar. Thanks.
Yeah, and then I would just suggest that if it's acceptable, we will then remove the words "is equitable" and just, I think the word she used was to achieve, and I would say then say at a level that achieves substantive equality with non-Indigenous police services. If that's acceptable to the mover and seconder? Yes, Aaron? Yes. All right, is there any further discussion? Chief Blackwater, microphone 23.
I'm in favor of the resolution too, but I wanted to point out that we do have a First Nation policing program in our area, but my biggest concern about this program is that RCMP detachment minimizes usage of the First Nation policing officer in our communities. So that needs to be addressed sometime down the road, because if there's funding for First Nation policing, it should focus on First Nation communities, not at usage of the RCMP detachment and ignore us, because there's a lot of things that are crucial in our communities, and these officers are too busy to attend to us. Thank you.
Excellent. Is there a need for further discussion on the Resolution 25? If not, let us move to the question. Are there any objections to Resolution 25 as amended? Seeing none, are there any abstentions? Seeing none, then Resolution 25, your last on-time resolution, is adopted by acclamation with a minute to spare. So, I want to remind the delegation that breakfast starts at 8 a.m. We are on at 9 o'clock. Housing, early learning and childcare, gaming, new relationship trust, infrastructure benefits, and the National Union Brotherhood Trust update. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Enjoy your evening, and we will see you tomorrow morning.